Utah looks empty. Dry canyons, broken stone, silence like a threat. But beneath the red dust and dead air lie 10,000 years of questions no one can answer. Rock art that defies translation. Settlements abandoned mid-meal. Fossils with no matching species. Carvings made by tools that don't exist. And fires burned for gods we've never named. Science has tried. Carbon dates, satellite scans, educated guesses. But the land just stares back. Older than memory, louder than fact. These aren't just mysteries. They're warnings carved in stone. Welcome to Utah. Pre-flood, prehistory, post-reason. Before we dive headfirst into the abyss, hit that subscribe button. We're building a library of mysteries that don't want to be solved, and you don't want to miss what's next. Let us know in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Midnight? Sunrise? Middle of nowhere at 3 a.m.? Because wherever you are, this story starts in the silence. Decapitated body and crawling lizard rock art near Vernal. In the sun-bleached desert near Vernal, Utah, where scrub brush outnumbers people and time seems to have simply given up, the rocks whisper stories. Some of them scream. Carved into a cliffside is a scene that defies both explanation and polite interpretation. A decapitated human figure, slumped and emptied of identity, with a lizard bizarrely, comically crawling directly beneath or over it, depending on who you ask. The entire composition feels like a joke told by someone who's been dead for 900 years and had a very bleak sense of humor. No one knows who etched it. Not for sure. The style resembles that of the Fremont culture, a mysterious people who occupied the region roughly between 300 and 1300 CE. But even that attribution is less of a conclusion, and more of a shrug, dressed up in archaeological language. And the meaning? Scholars, locals, and the occasional psychedelic enthusiast have all taken a stab, but the rock art just stares back, silent, unhelpful. Slightly amused. Some interpretations suggest it depicts a ritual execution, though that's a bit like saying Mona Lisa is about smiling. Others propose it shows a shamanic vision, a human shedding their earthly form, while the lizard represents a guide, or a soul, or a threat. You can pick whichever version best fits your brand of late-night paranoia. The truth is, the image refuses to settle into just one role. It slips between symbolic and literal, sacred and profane, cosmic and cartoonish, which is to say, it behaves exactly like a mystery should. Still, context is everything, or would be if any existed. The rock panel isn't part of a larger mural. It doesn't accompany a helpful pictograph of corn or antelope or a sun god with a speech bubble. It just exists. One moment there was smooth stone, the next, a grim little performance frozen in time. And let's talk about the lizard. Why a lizard? This is not a lion or eagle, no proud predator or noble totem. It's a creature that scuttles under rocks and grows back its tail if you try to kill it. In some cultures, lizards symbolize survival, rebirth, cunning. In others, decay, trickery, the underworld. Here, its meaning is suspended between all those possibilities like a fly in amber. It's crawling beneath a headless man, and no one, not the Fremont, not the UTEs, not the most credentialed PhDs, left us a key to decode it. Some theorists suggest the lizard is the reason for the beheading, as if it might be venomous or divine. Others reverse it. Perhaps the figure lost their head after the lizard came, possibly as a punishment or a sacrifice. There's even a theory that the whole scene depicts a cautionary tale, like an ancient desert meme. Don't mess with sacred lizards, or else. But again, these are just guesses dressed in academic robes. The art was discovered, or at least popularized, in the modern era, thanks to hikers and local ranchers who couldn't help but stop and stare. A few tried to mark it, date it, preserve it. Others simply took pictures, posted them online, and captioned them with things like, "What the fuck is this?" Arguably the most honest reaction archaeology ever receives. The Utah desert is full of petroglyphs, hundreds, thousands, but this particular duet of headless humanity and indifferent reptile lingers. It pokes at something primal, like a children's story that's been told wrong on purpose. And in a way, it might be the only kind of story that survives long enough to be misread. What remains especially unsettling is that we can't even be sure if it's meant to be horrifying or funny. Maybe it was a dark joke shared among tribe members. Maybe it marked the site of a literal execution. Maybe it was religious. Maybe it was entertainment. Maybe the artist was just very, very weird. Or maybe the lizard is us forever crawling under the ruins of forgotten people, looking for meaning in broken symbols, our heads full of questions and nothing else. And speaking of symbols that refuse to cooperate with any modern sense of order or meaning, let's now move into the deeper canyons of Fish Lake National Forest, where another set of carvings, even older and stranger, continues to resist interpretation like a cryptic language scrawled by ghosts. The Chalk Creek hieroglyphics await. Chalk Creek hieroglyphics, Fish Lake National Forest. Hidden beneath the swaying pines and quietly humming aspen groves of Fish Lake National Forest lies one of Utah's most cryptic and overlooked archaeological enigmas. Tucked along a ravine in the Chalk Creek area, a place known more for its fishing spots and elk herds than prehistoric riddles, is a collection of rock carvings that don't just defy easy categorization, they defy belonging at all. They've been called hieroglyphics, though that term is already a problem. It's a linguistic hand-me-down, applied out of habit more than accuracy. These aren't Egyptian symbols. They aren't Sumerian. They aren't even Fremont, Ute, or ancestral Puebloan in any way that scholars feel confident about. They're just there, incised deep into the pale limestone, with all the casual permanence of someone who assumed their language would be eternal. What makes the Chalk Creek hieroglyphics so strange isn't just that they're unknown, it's that they're unplaceable. No one can decisively say who carved them, when, or why. They don't fit the iconography of any known indigenous culture in the region, and unlike most petroglyphs that tell a story through familiar shapes, bighorn sheep, sunbursts, hunting scenes, spirals, these are colder, more abstract, less art, more message, or possibly warning. The symbols appear geometric, almost schematic interlocking lines, grids, ladder-like forms, and strange boxy spirals. Some resemble letters from no known alphabet. Others look like mechanical diagrams for devices no one has ever built. A few, disturbingly, seem to repeat in patterned sequences as if the artist wasn't expressing emotion or identity, but transmitting data. And yet, no one can decipher it. For over a century, amateur researchers, hikers, and fringe theorists have stumbled upon the site and left with more questions than they came with. Theories range from the plausible to the deeply ambitious. Some suggest the carvings are remnants of a proto-writing system from a lost tribe. Others believe its code possibly astronomical in nature, mapping star cycles or solstice points. A handful of particularly optimistic thinkers suggest pre-Columbian contact with transoceanic civilizations, Egyptian, Phoenician, or, naturally, extraterrestrial. Utah does have a reputation to maintain, after all. Of course, mainstream archaeologists roll their eyes at most of that. Still, they're not offering a solution either. And the carvings remain untouched, unsolved, unfriendly to explanation. Even the location is inconvenient. The site is remote, poorly marked, and difficult to access without local knowledge. It's not a curated, signposted petroglyph panel where school groups visit on field trips. It's hidden, like it wants to be forgotten. The forest has grown around it in a way that feels protective, like it's shielding something not from harm, but from discovery. The most unsettling thing about the Chalk Creek symbols, though, is how modern they feel. Unlike the flowing, organic shapes of Fremont rock art or the stylized animals of ancestral Puebloan imagery, these carvings feel almost industrial, mechanical, a design language from a people who understood something we don't, or didn't need to express things the way we do. Some symbols repeat across multiple panels. A grid pattern appears 5 times, a square within a square, 3, always carved with precision, always the same angle, the same depth. It's not doodling, it's intent. It feels like someone meant something by this but spoke in a syntax that no longer exists. And it gets worse. In recent years, some enthusiasts have started comparing these glyphs to patterns found in completely unrelated regions, particularly in the American Southwest and even the Canary Islands. A few symbols seem eerily similar, which opens a whole new trapdoor of mystery. Was there contact between these regions long before history allows it? Or is there something more fundamental at work, something about the human mind that creates the same symbols in isolation over and over for reasons we don't consciously understand? The forest, naturally, isn't talking. And perhaps the most poetic cruelty of this mystery is that it exists in a place called Chalk Creek, a name that evokes impermanence, smudging, the kind of message that's always on the verge of being erased. You have to wonder if whoever carved these knew their message wouldn't be understood. Or maybe they knew it would be found, and that not understanding it was part of the message. Because isn't that what real mystery is? A signal you can detect, but never decode. A shape that looks like language, but turns into silence the longer you stare at it. And staring we are. Still, if you think symbols scratched into stone are strange, wait until you encounter a perfect stone circle hidden in a cave that was never supposed to be visited, let alone found. Down in the red sandstone labyrinths of Canyonlands National Park lies a formation so precise, so quietly unsettling, that even the Park Service isn't quite sure how to talk about it. They just call it false kiva. And if you're still here staring into the sandstone void, wondering why a culture would carve perfect geometry into rock and then vanish without a trace, now might be a good time to subscribe. These mysteries don't explain themselves, but we'll keep digging anyway. Drop a comment below. Where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Late night rabbit hole, lunch break curiosity, or just another sleepless scroll into the uncanny? Either way, you're in it now. False kiva, stone circle, in cave, Canyonlands. There are places you find by accident, and then there are places you're not supposed to find at all. False kiva is one of the latter. Hidden deep in the canyons of Utah's Canyonlands National Park, high on a ledge that requires more than just curiosity to reach, sits a near-perfect circle of stones arranged within the mouth of a cave. It's precise, it's deliberate, and it is, officially, not on any map. The National Park Service doesn't maintain a trail to it anymore, and they definitely won't give you directions because whatever false kiva was meant to be, it's now classified as sensitive, which is government speak for, we don't fully understand what it is, but people keep messing it up. Still, people find it. Sometimes they follow vague rumors. Sometimes it's a GPS coordinate passed quietly between desert wanderers. Sometimes it's just the draw of the name false kiva and the need to see for themselves what it really means. And once they do, they're usually quiet for a long time. The formation itself is unnervingly symmetrical. A circular arrangement of stones, about waist high, set inside a natural alcove in the red rock, framing a sweeping panorama of buttes and mesas that stretch all the way to the horizon. The view alone feels spiritual, or at least cinematic, the kind of place you'd expect a revelation, or an ambush. But what gives false kiva its mystery is less about what you can see and more about what's missing. No one knows who built it. No one knows when it was built. And most importantly, no one knows why. Now, in southwestern archaeology, a kiva is typically understood as a ceremonial structure. The ancestral Puebloans built them usually round, often semi-subterranean, and associated with spiritual rituals, storytelling, seasonal observances, or other social activities that blur the line between the sacred and the mundane. But those kivas were built into villages. You'd find them surrounded by dwellings, storage units, community architecture. You know, people stuff. False kiva, on the other hand, sits in isolation. No village, no road, no water source, no supporting structures of any kind. Just this one solitary circle of stones, hidden in a cave on a cliff overlooking a wide and ancient silence, which has led some to say it isn't a true kiva at all, hence the name false kiva. As if giving it a disclaimer somehow removes the mystery. It doesn't. But here's where things get stranger. Despite its name, the energy of the place island, unignorable. People who've made the hike often describe it as charged, calm, ancient, or simply off. Not in a malevolent way, just in the way that suggests you've stepped outside of your normal understanding of space and time. Photographers have flocked here over the years, capturing jaw-dropping images of the stone circle with thunderclouds rolling overhead or the Milky Way slicing through the sky. Their photos tend to go viral, and each time they do, someone in the comments inevitably says, "What is that place?" Followed shortly by, "Can you still go there?" The Park Service, reluctantly, began pulling back access in the 2010 seconds. Too many visitors, too much erosion, too many people standing in the circle when they shouldn't have, or worse, rearranging the stones like they were adding their own line to someone else's ancient poem. In 2018, someone vandalized the site. After that, the secrecy became policy. False kiva vanished from maps. The unofficial trail was no longer maintained. Even the name became a kind of whispered taboo. You could still get there, but you had to want to. And even then, the cave doesn't give up its meaning easily. Some researchers argue the site may have been used as a celestial observatory. The cave's orientation and the circle's alignment with various points on the horizon suggest potential solstice or equinox markers. But again, these are educated guesses, the kind you make when no one leaves behind a plaque or a journal entry or a tour guide script. Other interpretations are more psychological. They suggest false kiva functions as a thin place, a spot where the veil between worlds or between perception and truth wears thin. The circle becomes a mirror. You bring your own meaning to it. You project your fears or hopes or questions into that ring of stones, and the silence throws them back at you. It's also possible, though this bothers people, that the circle wasn't meant for anything at all, that it was a personal act. One person, one moment. One strange construction for reasons now erased by time and wind and forgetting. But even that is a kind of meaning, isn't it? The idea that something could be built in a place no one would ever see, for a reason no one else could understand. That alone feels ancient, or modern, or both. And if a simple ring of rocks can unsettle the human urge to explain everything, then what do we do with entire cultures that simply walked away from their lives and left no real reason behind? Down in Range Creek Canyon, buried beneath the cottonwoods and sandstone folds, the Fremont people left behind their homes, their tools, their granaries, and vanished. No war, no fire, no warning. Just an echo. Range Creek Canyon, Fremont sites. If you're ever driving through eastern Utah and suddenly feel like the land around you is withholding secrets on purpose, you're probably getting close to Range Creek Canyon. Tucked between the rugged slopes of the Book Cliffs, far from the nearest strip mall, Range Creek doesn't advertise itself. It doesn't even try. The canyon is narrow, winding, and remote, accessible only by a rough dirt road and a stubborn disregard for paved comfort. But for those willing to endure the isolation, it offers something that almost no archaeological site in North America still can: an untouched time capsule. Here, scattered across the cliffs and mesas, are the remains of the Fremont people granaries still sealed, pit houses partially intact, artifacts left exactly where their owners dropped them nearly 1,000 years ago. It's not a reconstruction. It's not a museum. It's the real thing, and it's weirdly pristine. The canyon's modern rediscovery is almost as strange as what it contains. For over half a century, Range Creek was owned by a rancher named Waldo Wilcox, who, whether out of stubbornness or foresight, kept the place off limits. No developers, no researchers, no tourists. Just him, some cows, and miles of secrets. When he finally sold the land in the early 2000s, archaeologists flooded in like cautious children, entering a room that somehow remained exactly as it was when Grandma died. And what they found was staggering. Dozens of stone granaries tucked into inaccessible cliff ledges, rock art panels that had never been photographed, pit houses containing tools, ceramics, and food remnants undisturbed. Some sites even had footprints still preserved in ancient clay. It was as if the Fremont people had simply gone out for water and never returned. That's the mystery. Between around 300 and 1300 CE, the Fremont occupied vast swaths of Utah. They were horticulturalists, hunters, and artists, living in semi-permanent settlements across river valleys and canyonlands, and then somewhere between 1,000, 150, and 1,300, they just vanished. Not wiped out, not conquered, just gone. Their structures were left behind, their food stores, tools, and ceremonial items left behind. There's no widespread evidence of conflict, no obvious sign of a sudden catastrophe. Instead, there's only the growing silence of abandonment. And in Range Creek, that silence is deafening. Because here, the preservation is so good, the disappearance feels personal. You walk through the canyon and see how they lived, how they stored corn in basket-lined caches, how they carved animals and abstract figures into rock walls, how they built their homes into the cliffs, using the natural terrain like an architectural partner. And yet, even with all this detail, the why of their disappearance remains maddeningly out of reach. Several theories have been proposed, of course. The usual suspects make their rounds. Drought? It's plausible. Tree ring data from the region suggests a prolonged dry period in the 13th century, but the Fremont weren't strangers to scarcity. They had storage systems, seasonal migration routes, and a mixed subsistence strategy. They had options. Resource depletion? Again, plausible, but Range Creek is not a place easily emptied. The terrain is rugged, but fertile in the right seasons. There's water, game, plant diversity. It doesn't add up to a forced exit. Cultural migration? This theory suggests the Fremont didn't vanish but integrated into neighboring tribes, maybe the UTEs or Paiutes, which is tidy, but unsupported by clear archaeological continuity. Their material culture doesn't gradually transform. It stops. One day, they were here. The next, they weren't. Even the rock art offers no final clues. Fremont panels in Range Creek show horned figures, dancing forms, spirals, and serpents sometimes playful, sometimes eerie, always silent. Whatever cosmology they adhered to, it didn't leave behind a closing chapter. No farewell message carved into stone, just the echo of movement in a canyon that now feels too still. And there's an irony in that stillness. Because the Fremont built for permanence. Their stone granaries are perched high on ledges that required serious planning to access impossible for casual thieves or curious animals. They thought long-term. They stored surplus. They created art that clearly meant something. And yet, the culture behind all that intention quietly dissolved. They left their structures behind like fossils of ambition, ghosts of continuity. Which raises the uncomfortable question. What does it mean when a culture that tried so hard to endure doesn't? That's the kind of question Range Creek forces you to ask, whether you want to or not. You stare at a 1,000-year-old storage bin that still smells faintly of corn, and your brain starts to itch with possibilities. Did they walk away in ceremony? In shame? In surrender? Or were they simply following something none of us will ever understand? And while we're here, dwelling in lost cultures and preserved silences, Let's go deeper still into darkness itself. Not metaphorical, but literal, because Utah holds secrets underground, too. Secrets buried in volcanic tubes carved by ancient lava flows, where evidence of human occupation stretches back over 7,000 years. And down there, in the cool dark, the question isn't just who was here, it's why they chose to descend into fire-carved stone and stay. Hogup Cave layers and cultural transitions. From above, Hogup Cave doesn't look like a time machine. It's a modest hole in a limestone ridge overlooking the Great Salt Lake Desert, surrounded by salt flats, brush, and a wind that seems to have somewhere better to be. There's no flashy monument, no polished signage announcing the depth of human history inside, and that's fitting, because what Hogup Cave reveals doesn't shout, it whispers in layers. Discovered and excavated in the 1,960 seconds, Hogup Cave quickly established itself as one of the most significant archaeological sites in the Great Basin. Inside, archaeologists uncovered over 11,000 years of human occupation compressed into just a few meters of sediment layers upon layers of tools, textiles, food remains, and cultural debris, preserved almost absurdly well thanks to the dry cave conditions. It's the kind of place where a discarded sandal from 2000 BCE can sit inches away from a rabbit skin blanket dropped in the Middle Ages. But what makes Hogup Cave truly fascinating and deeply puzzling isn't just the preservation, it's the pattern, or more accurately, the lack of one. As you move through the strata of the cave's debris field, what emerges is not a steady arc of cultural development, but a series of unpredictable shifts. The people who used this cave didn't follow a single line of progress. They adapted, abandoned, reinvented. Sometimes they were sedentary. Sometimes they were nomadic. Sometimes they stored food. Sometimes they didn't. The culture inside Hogup didn't evolve in a straight line. It zigzagged, stuttered, and occasionally did a full about-face. And no one really knows why. There are transitions in tool types. In one layer, you might find finely chipped projectile points associated with small game hunting. Just a few centimeters below or above, you'll find heavier, cruder tools for processing plant materials or butchering larger animals. Then, those tools vanish again. Then, they return. It's not seasonal. It's not linear. It's like history having mood swings. The same goes for the cave's remarkable array of woven artifacts. Researchers uncovered intricately crafted basketry, sandals, mats, even clothing fragments. But their styles and methods of construction shift dramatically without warning. It's as if every few centuries, a new group of people moved in with a completely different Pinterest board of survival techniques. Or the same people forgot what they were doing, reinvented it from scratch, and did it better or worse the next time. What's even more disorienting is the cave's long intervals of no occupation. There are periods where no one seems to have lived or stored anything there at all. No charcoal, no food, no tools, just sterile dust. And then, out of nowhere, signs of habitation return. Campfires relit, bones scattered, tools dropped again. It's like watching a place flicker in and out of cultural existence, as if human presence itself were a tide, rising and receding for reasons we still don't understand. Several explanations have been floated over the years. Some archaeologists blame climate. The Great Basin is, after all, an unstable environment. Water sources appear and vanish. Game migrations shift. Droughts hit hard and often. Perhaps people came to Hogup when the nearby marshes and springs were generous, and left when they turned to salt. Others point to shifting trade routes or social alliances, fluid networks that might explain why certain artifact styles show up briefly and then disappear. Maybe the cave was a satellite outpost, used periodically by different groups depending on who controlled the region. Maybe it was a cultural crossroads, or a refuge. But none of these theories fully explain the strangeness of the cave's layers, the abrupt changes, the inconsistent presence. The complete lack of narrative cohesion. It's as if every layer is a new sentence in a book that keeps changing languages mid-paragraph. One of the more poetic theories suggests that Hogup Cave wasn't just a place for survival. It was a memory device, a communal locker, a space returned to, again and again, by people who didn't know each other but somehow still remembered the cave, maybe not by name, but by need. That, perhaps, is the most enduring mystery of Hogup Cave. Not just the things people left behind, but the pattern of leaving itself, the returns, the absences, the quiet suggestions that this cave meant something, even when it was empty. Because an empty cave can still hold meaning. It can be a marker, a signal, a shelter remembered by descendants of those who once passed through. Maybe even a sacred site, its importance invisible to us, encoded not in carvings or monuments but in the simple fact that people kept coming back. And just when you think you're starting to understand that rhythm, those patterns of return and retreat Utah throws another twist. Just south of here, in a hardened landscape shaped by fire, archaeologists have found signs that ancient people were descending into the very bones of the earth, not for shelter, not just for survival, but for reasons still hidden in the black tunnels of cooled lava. Human use of lava tubes dating back 7,000 years. Utah is full of places where the earth cracked open, poured out its insides, and cooled just long enough for something stranger to move in. Lava tubes. Those long, tunnel-like voids left behind after molten rivers drained away are one of the great geological leftovers of the region's ancient volcanic past. You'd expect them to be empty, cold, quiet. Geologic footnotes, not chapters in human history. And yet, scattered across southern Utah's basalt fields, archaeologists have found evidence that people weren't just aware of these subterranean corridors, they were using them deliberately. And as far back as 7,000 years ago. The most compelling of these sites lie within the Black Rock Desert volcanic field. From above, the area looks like a scar on the earth, jagged flows of ancient lava, black rock folded and broken like a crust of burnt bread. But beneath those twisted ridges run miles of hollow tunnels, some just big enough to crawl through, others as wide and tall as a train tunnel. And in at least a few of them, human presence has been confirmed. Charcoal stains, fire pits, stone tools, bones, basket fragments, all sealed within the cooled veins of once liquid rock, protected from wind, sun, and erosion. Perfectly preserved in silence. Now, this isn't just a case of someone wandered in and left a footprint. These aren't random visits. At several sites, repeated use is clear layers of ash from multiple fires, fragments from different time periods. The evidence suggests that ancient peoples came back again and again. But what were they doing down there? This is where the mystery begins. At first glance, the lava tubes seem like poor candidates for regular use. They're difficult to access, often narrow, often steep, absolutely pitch black after the first few feet. Some are so remote and irregular that even modern researchers, armed with headlamps and satellite maps, struggle to find and enter them. And yet, 7,000 years ago, long before the wheel reached this continent, people were navigating these voids with intention. One working theory is that the tubes offered shelter from the extremes of the surface climate. During the blazing summer, the underground stays cool. In the bitter desert winter, it holds warmth. But while that might explain a single night's rest, it doesn't explain the fires, the artifacts, the rituals. Some tubes show signs of ceremonial use. In at least one location, a hearth was placed precisely beneath a skylight opening where sunlight could stream in just briefly, like a spotlight. That's not survival. That's symbolism. Someone, long ago, stood beneath that shaft of light and did something that mattered. Other sites contain broken tools or bones that seem intentionally placed, not just discarded. Was it offering? Mourning? Teaching? Initiation? We don't know. And the questions keep multiplying. How did they navigate? Torches? Ember carriers? Some of these tubes twist and fork like a maze. Without modern lighting, getting lost would have been both easy and fatal. But evidence suggests they didn't get lost. They knew these spaces. One possibility: oral maps, stories told in such vivid spatial detail that the tunnels could be walked in the mind long before they were walked in body. Or maybe they used a kind of breadcrumb trail, charcoal marks, stone stacks, dropped objects, temporary lines through permanent darkness. There's also the question of why this began in the first place. What drives a person or a culture to voluntarily descend into the lungs of an extinct volcano? The answers, like the air in those tunnels, are thin. There's no writing, no explanatory rock art. Just the same old clues: burned wood, stone tools, scattered bones, and the unsettling realization that you're standing where someone else once stood, holding fire against the dark, looking for something. Maybe sanctuary, maybe a sign, and maybe what they found wasn't meant to be brought back to the surface. What we do know is that these underground sites weren't isolated phenomena. Similar discoveries have been made in lava tubes across the West in Idaho, Oregon, even Hawaii. Different cultures, different times. Same impulse: downward, inward, into the rock. There's a strange poetry in it. Above ground, life changes. Cultures rise and fall, landscapes shift. But down in the tubes, everything holds. It's as if the lava remembered them, when history did not. The more we study these subterranean spaces, the more the timeline of human adaptation stretches. We used to imagine early inhabitants as surface-bound foragers, tied to rivers and sun cycles. But now, we're forced to reckon with a different idea, one where ancient people willingly entered the earth, not just to survive, but perhaps to commune, to hide, to mark something sacred, or to disappear for a while. And speaking of disappearance, Utah is also home to fossils that suggest an entirely different kind of vanishing, not of people, but of species. Entire evolutionary threads, tangled and snapped, preserved in stone across millions of years. And while paleontologists keep digging for patterns, the fossil record here just keeps asking harder questions. Utah's exceptional dinosaur fossil record. The thing about Utah is that it remembers things you didn't ask it to. Long before human footprints ever touched its desert sands or carved symbols into canyon walls, Utah was alive in ways we can barely imagine: lush, humid, sprawling with ferns the size of buildings and rivers, the width of regrets. It was once a shoreline, then a rainforest, then a graveyard, then a desert. And in every one of those transformations, it kept the receipts. Utah doesn't just have dinosaur fossils. It has an entire prehistoric resume. Layers upon layers of sediment, each one a chapter in a geological epic written across 500 million years. You walk through places like the Morrison Formation or the Cedar Mountain Formation, and you're not just walking through dirt. You're walking across the stratified aftermath of entire ecosystems. Here, dinosaurs didn't just live, they thrived. And then they vanished. And while science has mapped out the broad strokes: mass extinctions, asteroid impacts, climatic shifts, there are still chapters missing. Species with no evolutionary cousins, habitats that shouldn't exist where they do, fossil beds where predators outnumber prey, or where mass deaths occurred without any clear catastrophe. For all the clarity the rock layers provide, they also whisper a constant refrain: you don't know the whole story. Let's start with what we do know. Utah is home to more dinosaur species than almost any other state in the U.S., rivaled only by Montana. It boasts iconic sites like Dinosaur National Monument, where you can see a literal wall of bones mid-excavation, still embedded in stone. Elsewhere, in places like the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, Whole new species are discovered with unnerving regularity, as if evolution got a little too creative in this corner of the continent. There's Utah raptor for one, a predator the size of a pickup truck with claws that could open doors, if Jurassic Park had been slightly more accurate. Then there's Gryposaurus monumentensis, a duck-billed herbivore that looks like it was designed by a committee who couldn't agree on what the front end should look like. These aren't just bones. They're punchlines in nature's long-running joke about the arrogance of predictability. But for every dramatic skeleton and name that Saurus headline, there are deeper puzzles. Like the raptor death trap, a fossil site in the Cedar Mountain Formation, where multiple Utah raptors, all different sizes, were found together. Some scientists think it's evidence of pack behavior. Others suggest it was a feeding frenzy gone wrong, a pileup of greed and mud. But no one knows for sure. The scene is frozen, mid-action, with no narrator to explain who chased who or why they never made it out. Then there are the mass bone beds, like the Cleveland Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry, which holds the highest concentration of Allosaurus fossils ever found. Dozens of individuals, all in one place, all jumbled together, some partial, some nearly complete. It's not a nesting ground, it's not a feeding site, it's not a burial plot, it's something else. A graveyard of apex predators who apparently couldn't stop dying in the same spot for reasons still under debate. Water trap, volcanic gas, behavioral blind spot? No theory is bulletproof, and every new fossil just adds more variables. Meanwhile, climate records pulled from surrounding sediment layers tell an inconsistent story. There are dry spells that don't line up with die-offs, wet periods that don't bring population booms. Herbivore species that thrived in conditions their skull structures suggest they shouldn't have tolerated. Even the foliage preserved alongside the bones, petrified wood, leaf impressions, pollen samples sometimes suggests environmental combinations that don't quite add up. Swamp plants next to desert flora, tropical ferns beside arid scrub. It's as if the landscape kept changing the rules without warning, and the species tried to keep up until they didn't. Even the footprints are mysterious. In places like the Street George Dinosaur Discovery Site, there are thousands of preserved tracks, perfect three-toed impressions, left in what was once wet sand or lake bed. Some tracks show group behavior, some show panic, some end abruptly, as if the creature simply vanished or was pulled from the surface into something not friendly to fossilization. And while paleontologists are usually careful with their language, there's a quiet unease that runs through many field reports from Utah. Things don't always behave here the way they do elsewhere. Evolutionary lineages branch in unexpected directions. Ecosystems appear and vanish too quickly. Morphological features evolve suddenly and disappear without a trace. Which raises the bigger question. What was going on here that made life so unstable? Some propose that Utah was once a kind of ecological intersection where climates, water systems, and migration corridors collided, a place of high evolutionary pressure. But others argue something subtler, that the land itself, with its shifting terrain and fault lines, created constant chaos, that no species ever had long enough to get comfortable. Which may be why, despite all the fossils, Utah's record feels less like a textbook and more like a recurring fever dream. Familiar species show up in the wrong time periods. Oddball creatures appear with no evolutionary context, then disappear just as quickly. It's a fossil record that reads like the cliff notes to a novel no one ever finished. And yet, among all these ancient bones and theories, there's one find that refuses to sit quietly on any timeline. A skeleton, or rather, several that seem to defy not just evolutionary expectations, but geological logic itself. Because buried in the Cretaceous strata of eastern Utah, beneath layers of rock supposedly untouched for over 100 million years, someone found human skeletons. And no one agrees how they got there. Moab man, Malachite man, skeletons. In the high desert near Moab, Utah, a landscape that feels like the surface of another planet after a long drought, there's a story buried in stone that refuses to behave. It begins with a dig in the 1970 seconds at the edge of the Green River, where a team of workers was quarrying uranium ore from a Cretaceous rock formation known as the Dakota Sandstone. The area was already famous for its ancient fossils, dinosaur tracks, marine shells, petrified plants, but no one expected to find a human skeleton. They called him Moab Man, or more dramatically, Malachite Man, thanks to the bluish-green staining left on the bones from nearby copper minerals. That part, at least, sounds ordinary enough. Skeletons are found all the time. But this one wasn't lying in a cave or nestled in a mound. It was reportedly embedded in Cretaceous rock, as in the same geological layer that dates back roughly 100 million years when Utah was still part of a vast inland sea and dinosaurs like Acrocanthosaurus and Tenontosaurus ruled the floodplains. According to conventional geology, anatomically modern humans wouldn't appear on the planet for another 98 million years. So either the dating was wrong, the skeleton was intrusive, or, well, the implications get weird fast. But the weirdness didn't stop at one skeleton. Multiple human remains were reportedly found in that same layer, within feet of each other, some of them relatively intact, others partial. The original reports claimed they were located several feet below the surface, inside the uranium-rich strata, not just resting on top of it. Cue the geological scandal. On one side, mainstream scientists quickly moved to explain the anomaly. The burials were intrusive. In other words, the individuals had been buried long after the rock was formed, with their graves cutting down into the Cretaceous material. The bones had simply settled into existing cracks or voids in the stone. It looked like they were part of the ancient layer, but really, they were just opportunistic tenants in an older apartment. And to be fair, this explanation holds up in many archaeological cases. Natural erosion, animal burrowing, and even seismic activity can distort stratigraphy in ways that make the old and the new seem like roommates. It happens. But not everyone bought it. A handful of independent researchers, amateur geologists, and a very vocal corner of the fringe science community looked at the Moab Man discovery and saw something else. A deliberate burial inside unbroken rock. Some argued that the skeletal remains were too well preserved, too deep, and too undisturbed to be intrusive, that there were no signs of grave shafts, no tool marks, no disruptions in the surrounding sediment, just bones, quietly resting where they absolutely should not have been. Some even went further, claiming this was evidence of a pre-dinosaur human presence, a civilization lost to time, or a chronology entirely different from what we've been taught. Naturally, this triggered a flurry of papers, rebuttals, counter-rebuttals, and professional eye-rolling. The University of Utah examined the remains. The Smithsonian weighed in. The consensus eventually landed where most inconvenient finds do. Yes, the skeletons were real. Yes, the uranium ore was Cretaceous. But no, the humans were not. Radiocarbon dating, while limited in some respects, was applied to the bones. The results suggested they were no older than 2,000 years. Most likely Native American burials, accidentally disturbed by modern quarrying operations. That would place them somewhere around the late Archaic or early Fremont period. But here's the problem. Even if the bones are only a couple thousand years old, no one has yet offered a completely satisfactory account of how they ended up sealed in uranium-laced rock. With no visible burial cuts or stratigraphic disruption, the simplest explanation is that the rock was fractured naturally, the grave slid in, and the confusion followed. And maybe that's true. Probably it's true, but probably doesn't make for good mystery. Especially not in a state like Utah, where the land loves to blur the boundary between the explainable and the unsettling. Here, even the official version of things has an asterisk. Every answer seems to lead to another footnote. Every explanation arrives late and out of breath. And even if the Moab skeletons are only 2,000 years old, that doesn't erase the optics. There's still something deeply strange about finding fully formed human remains in the same rock layer where you expect nothing but dinosaur bones and primitive plant fossils. It's a juxtaposition that begs for a narrative, even if the facts resist one. Because what if, just maybe, a story we've dismissed as intrusion turns out to be the intrusion itself? What if the real error isn't in the dating, but in the certainty? Utah is full of cautionary tales masquerading as discoveries. This is one of them, a moment when the past seems to glance back at us, not with answers, but with questions we're not built to ask. And if one lost body in ancient stone can cause that much confusion, imagine what happens when people start chasing something even more elusive. A gold mine hidden by shadows, protected by legends, and pursued for centuries without proof. Just beyond these dusty canyons lies the story of the lost Rhoades mine, an enigma made of rumors, gold, betrayal, and silence. Lost Rhoades, Josephine, mine. There's something about gold that rots the timeline. It warps logic, frays memory, and leaves history bent in just the right places. And in Utah, the most notorious bend of all is the legend of the lost Rhoades mine, a tale so entangled in secrecy, greed, and contradiction that it doesn't matter whether the gold was real. The madness absolutely was. The story goes like this. Sometime in the 19th century, a man named Thomas Rhoades, or his son, Caleb, depending on which version you're told, was shown the location of a massive gold mine by local Native Americans. The source of this mine? Spanish treasure left behind centuries earlier. Or maybe it was ancient indigenous gold. Or possibly even pre-Columbian, pre-contact, pre-everything gold, if you believe the more esoteric versions. There's a lot of them. What's constant in every version is this. The Rhoades family knew something they shouldn't have, and for a while, they benefited from it. According to persistent lore, Brigham Young himself, the prophet and leader of the early Mormon church, was involved. Some accounts suggest he authorized the extraction of this gold in secret, using it to finance construction of temples, settle debts with the U.S. government, and keep the church economically afloat during its most precarious years. These claims are impossible to prove and equally hard to ignore. A few surviving documents, buried in Utah's historical archives, hint that church tithing records may have included unexplained gold deliveries during the 1,800 seconds. Mints received mysterious raw bullion from the Utah Territory. Letters reference mineral gifts from unnamed sources. And Thomas Rhoades, who once served as a bishop and scout, spent years wandering the high Uintas with a strange kind of purpose, like a man following directions he didn't write. But here's where the mystery turns. At some point, the Rhoades family either lost the location or lost the right to speak of it. In one version, the Native Americans who shared the secret eventually revoked it, angered by betrayal or broken promises. In another, a curse was placed on the mine itself, something old, something sacred. There are even rumors that the mine was resealed with stone and ash, hidden by the Ute or Paiute tribes, who considered it a place never meant to be disturbed again. Either way, the Rhoades stopped producing gold, and the location of the mine vanished. But the story didn't. For over 150 years, treasure hunters have scoured the mountains, canyons, and alpine basins of northern Utah in search of this so-called lost mine. Whole lifetimes have been consumed in its pursuit. Some seekers end up poor, others paranoid. A few never return at all. The Uinta Mountains, one of the story's supposed locations, are a notoriously unforgiving range. Glacial peaks, labyrinthine valleys, sudden storms. There are countless places to lose your footing, or your mind. And yet, every few years, someone comes forward with a new clue. A carved stone with a symbol, a map passed down from a pioneer ancestor. A journal filled with directions that only make sense when held up to moonlight on the summer solstice. It's the same cycle, over and over. Find the legend, believe the legend, try to crack the legend, disappear into the legend. Skeptics argue the entire story is bunk, that no gold mine ever existed, that Rhoades was either deluded or lying, or both, that the church had no need for such covert financing, that the entire narrative was inflated by frontier gossip and posthumous myth-making. They might be right, but they can't explain the patterns. Multiple explorers, decades apart, have found similar symbols etched into stone: arrows, dots, spirals, crosses, some leading nowhere, some vanishing as soon as they appear. A few even intersect with other treasure myths, like the Aztec gold of Montezuma's lost treasure, or hidden Spanish caches supposedly left behind during failed expeditions. It's almost like the land itself is playing along, offering just enough to keep the game going. And beneath the legend lies a darker, more philosophical question. If hundreds of people believe in something that can't be found, but still structure their lives around it, does it matter whether it was ever real? The Rhoades mine may never have existed, or it may have been found, emptied, and forgotten, but its absence has produced more obsession, secrecy, and silent desperation than any confirmed gold ever has. That's the kind of haunting a place remembers. That's the kind of echo that gets embedded in maps and bloodlines and whispered instructions passed down like family heirlooms. Look for the V-shaped tree. Count 7 paces east. When you reach the granite face, knock 3 times. Whether those instructions lead anywhere is irrelevant. The point is, someone believed they did. And belief, as we're about to see, doesn't always require centuries of tradition to take root. Sometimes all it takes is a strange object in the desert, metallic, inhuman, and placed exactly where it shouldn't be. One morning in 2020, a helicopter pilot spotted something glinting in the red rock. A monolith. Smooth, angular, silent, and absolutely not from around here. Metal monolith in Utah desert. It began, as these things often do, with a sheep. In late 2020, a team from the Utah Department of Public Safety was conducting an aerial survey of bighorn sheep populations in the rugged sandstone labyrinths of southeastern Utah. Flying over a maze of red rock canyons near the San Juan River, they spotted something that should not have been there. Something angular, metallic, shining like a mistake. They landed the helicopter and hiked in, and there it was. A gleaming, vertical monolith, 3-sided, about 10 feet tall, smooth, reflective, and planted firmly into the desert floor. Not toppled, not tilted, not naturally placed. Not eroded or weathered like everything else within 50 miles. Just standing there, like it belonged to a different ecosystem or a different century. The object looked industrial, surgical, sci-fi. Some said it resembled the black monolith from 2001, a space odyssey, though this one was silver and a bit shabbier up close. Welded seams, brushed metal panels, no obvious purpose, no inscription, no explanation. Just a metal thing in the middle of nowhere, silently waiting for someone to find it. Which, of course, someone finally did. The news broke online with the exact velocity you'd expect. At first, local outlets treated it like a curious oddity, but within 48 hours it was international. The headlines came fast. Mysterious metal monolith, discovered in Utah desert, alien artifact or art installation. Officials, baffled by desert monolith. Monolith appears, internet loses mind. And why not? 2020 was already a year vibrating with apocalyptic energy, wildfires, pandemic, lockdowns, political upheaval. And then, as if scripted by a cosmic prankster with a flair for symbolism, this thing shows up mute, unnatural, perfect in its weirdness. Everyone wanted to believe it meant something. That it was a message, a threshold, a plot twist. But the object refused to speak. No artist came forward. No agency claimed responsibility. No one had a clue who put it there or when. Satellite images later showed that it had been in place since at least 2016, just sitting there in silence, waiting for the right angle of sunlight and helicopter approach to become visible to human eyes. The Bureau of Land Management, caught between bureaucratic confusion and social media hysteria, released a statement saying they had no idea what it was or who owned it. And then, just as mysteriously as it appeared, it vanished. Roughly 10 days after the monolith was discovered, it was gone, overnight, removed by persons unknown. Only a shallow hole and a few footprints remained. Some claimed to have witnessed the removal. A group of men, reportedly environmentalists, took it down to prevent crowd damage to the fragile desert ecosystem. One of them allegedly muttered, "Leave no trace," as the monolith was hauled away. But that only deepened the mystery. Because no matter how well-meaning the removal might have been, the fact remained. Something had been placed, without permission or context, into one of the most remote regions of the American Southwest, and no one noticed for years. That's not just unusual, that's unsettling. And then, just as the public was catching its breath, more monoliths started appearing. Romania, California, New Mexico, the Netherlands, dozens of them, in different shapes and materials, started popping up across the world. Some were obvious copycats, some were hoaxes, others were elaborate pranks or guerrilla art pieces, but the original one, the Utah monolith, remained the focal point of the obsession. Because it was first, because it had no context, because it tapped into something older than art or prank. It felt alien, not necessarily extraterrestrial, but other. As if someone or something had buried a psychological landmine in the desert, timed to explode just when the world was most off balance. And maybe that's what makes the monolith more than just a viral story. It wasn't the object itself, it was the moment it appeared, the contrast, that slick, sterile geometry against the gnarled, ancient chaos of the Utah desert, the absence of explanation. The refusal to play by the rules of storytelling, that's what got under people's skin. Was it a message? A mirror? A trap? Art historians speculated it was a tribute to minimalism. Conspiracy theorists linked it to surveillance tech. Others wondered if it marked some kind of invisible boundary between timelines, between realities, between sanity and whatever comes after. No theory ever stuck. The desert swallowed them all. And maybe that's the lesson, that sometimes mystery doesn't come from what a thing is, but from the friction between what it could be and what we need it to be. Because in Utah, mystery isn't the glitch in the record, it's the native language of the landscape. And as we'll see, that language wasn't only written in bones and metal. All across the state, from the dry lake beds of the Great Basin to the crumbling cliff faces of nowhere towns, petroglyphs appear etched symbols without translation. Messages carved into stone by hands long gone, speaking in a dialect no one alive still understands. What they were trying to say, no one knows. But the rocks are still talking, uninterpreted. Petroglyphs, across the Great Basin. There's a point, somewhere in the vastness between Delta and Ely, where the desert doesn't feel like land anymore, it feels like static. Heat-shimmering silence stretches in every direction, broken only by wind, dust, and the occasional jackrabbit fleeing from nothing in particular. You look around, and your brain starts inventing things just to keep itself busy. Shadows become faces. Rocks become monuments. You start to suspect the land is watching you back, and then somewhere along a cliff, or tucked behind a boulder that has no right to be shaped like that, you see them. Lines, spirals, figures, eyes, etched into the stone like they were left there for you, even though they weren't. This is the Great Basin's unofficial writing system, a vast, silent, unsolved archive. And it has never been interpreted. Utah's portion of the Great Basin stretching across its western edge contains one of the most staggering concentrations of rock art in North America. Thousands of petroglyphs carved into basalt, sandstone, and limestone, scattered across dry canyons and weather-beaten ridgelines. Some are high up, where only the most determined would reach. Others are right by the road, overlooked by everyone. Most of them are old, very old, and no one knows exactly what they say. That's not an exaggeration. That's the mystery. Unlike written languages with known alphabets or symbolic systems tied to spoken words, these petroglyphs resist decoding. They don't follow a grammatical structure. There are no Rosetta Stones. No reliable translation keys. Just symbols repeated, yes, but without context. A zigzag here, a concentric circle there, humanoid shapes with antlers, footprints walking vertically. And of course, the ever-popular spirals. Always spirals. The Fremont people who occupied much of Utah between roughly 300 and 1300 CE are usually credited with many of these carvings, but they're not alone. Some glyphs appear older, far older, possibly created by archaic cultures going back 4,000 to 7,000 years. Others might be younger, created by the Ute or Paiute peoples, whose traditions overlapped and intertwined with the landscape in ways modern archaeologists still haven't fully untangled. But regardless of who made them, the effect is the same. The symbols endure, while their meanings dissolve. Many of the carvings clearly meant something. The depth of incision, the careful repetition, the placement all suggest intention. These weren't idle doodles or casual markings. Some panels are high up on vertical cliffs, accessible only by climbing. Others are set beside springs or migration corridors, hinting at their connection to hunting, water, or seasonal cycles. But what they communicated, or whether they were meant to communicate at all, is a matter of debate. Were they markers? Maps? Religious expressions? Artistic statements? Warnings? A mixture of all the above? Ask 10 experts, and you'll get 11 theories. Some anthropologists suggest the symbols were mnemonic devices, visual cues used in storytelling or oral tradition. Others lean towards shamanic interpretations, arguing that the petroglyphs represent visions, altered states of consciousness, or dream records. There are even those who propose astronomical explanations, tying spiral patterns to solstices or equinoxes, star paths, lunar cycles. And then there's the darker idea, that the symbols weren't meant to be read by us, that they were made for gods, or spirits, or the land itself, in which case, trying to translate them is like eavesdropping on a prayer in a language no longer spoken even by those who once believed. What's most unnerving is that the same symbols reappear across hundreds of miles, sometimes centuries apart. The same arcing serpent, the same inverted figures, the same bizarre blend of geometry and animal. It's almost as if they were part of a long-forgotten visual tradition, one that once made perfect sense, but collapsed without a written counterpart to anchor it. And yet, despite our ignorance, people are still drawn to them. Every year, amateur sleuths, rogue linguists, and spiritually inclined hikers make pilgrimages to sites like Parowan Gap, Capitol Reef, or 9 Mile Canyon. They stare at the walls. They sketch the symbols. Some even attempt translations, usually invoking astrology, numerology, or inevitably aliens. But the rocks remain quiet. Even more perplexing are the orphan panels petroglyph sites that are entirely isolated. No nearby water source, no evidence of habitation, no trail, path, or strategic reason for placement. Just a cliff face in the middle of nothing, with a few carefully chiseled shapes looking out into the desert as if waiting for someone to return. And maybe that's the most unsettling part, not the mystery itself, but the intention behind it, because the people who made these carvings didn't do so casually. They hiked, climbed, prepared, endured. They meant for these symbols to last. They weren't just leaving messages, they were leaving permanence, something meant to survive. And it has. But not the meaning, just the marks, like a message in a bottle tossed into a future that never arrived. And if these symbols could travel across millennia without their keys, what else might be scattered across the desert just out of view, just past comprehension? Some formations in Utah suggest more than communication. They suggest design, geometry, alignment, structures not made to be homes, but to point at something else entirely. Because in the cliff dwellings and high alcoves of the Southwest, certain architectural patterns have begun to raise eyebrows not for what they contain, but for what they face. Some researchers now believe those ancient walls may have been arranged not just for survival, but for the stars. Unexplained alignments or patterns in cliff dwellings, suggesting astronomical purpose. They were built high above the ground, sometimes so high it's hard to imagine anyone climbing up to them, let alone living there. Cliff dwellings, hollowed-out stone alcoves carved into sheer walls of sandstone. Shelters perched above canyons, sometimes stacked in tiers, sometimes tucked deep in shadow, always just out of reach of the casual hiker. From the outside, they look like architecture born from desperation. Harsh land, harsh climate, hostile neighbors. Build your home into a cliff, and you've got a defensive advantage. Build it high enough, and no one can sneak up on you. It's logical. But logic starts to slip when you look closer. Because some of these cliff dwellings weren't just positioned for defense or shelter. They were aligned with an eerie precision to solar, lunar, and even stellar events. Some doorways face exact east, so the first rays of the solstice sun strike the back wall. Some niches flood with light only during the equinox. Shadows pass through carved slots and across rock panels like clock hands, marking time in slow, deliberate sweeps. It's not all of them. Not every dwelling has this strange alignment, but enough do that archaeologists have stopped calling it coincidence. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. At first, these alignments were considered a fringe theory, the kind of claim whispered by stargazers and amateur explorers. But as the studies piled up, the pattern became undeniable. From Mesa Verde in Colorado to Hovenweep on the Utah border and deeper into the red rock folds of Bears Ears and Cedar Mesa, there are structures that behave like calendars. Stone doorways and windows aligned so precisely with astronomical events that it becomes hard to call them accidental. Some are small and almost invisible unless you're standing in the right spot at the right time of year. Others are dramatic. Long shafts of sunlight piercing through narrow openings to illuminate specific rock art panels or niches, only on a particular day, often solstices or equinoxes. One famous example is the so-called Sunday Dagger at Fajada Butte in nearby Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. It's not in Utah, but it's relevant because it set the precedent. 3 stone slabs, leaning against a spiral petroglyph. At the summer solstice, a dagger-shaped beam of sunlight slices through the slabs and bisects the spiral. At the winter solstice, the beam touches the edge, a prehistoric calendar built out of shadows. Utah has its own versions, though less photographed and far less understood. Some cliff dwellings in southeastern Utah feature T-shaped doorways, an architectural choice with unclear function. But a few of these T-doors frame the rising or setting sun with suspicious elegance during key solar events. At certain ruins, light hits niches carved into back walls only on 2 days of the year. In others, shadow patterns trace lunar cycles. Some researchers suggest entire room layouts were designed around the movement of celestial bodies. If that's true, it rewrites the way we view these structures. Not just shelters, but observatories, temples, instruments of time. But here's where it gets slippery. These alignments aren't always perfectly precise. Some match up within a few degrees. Others seem more symbolic than mathematical. This gives skeptics just enough wiggle room to argue coincidence. After all, in a landscape as dramatic as Utah's, you're going to get some interesting sun angles. Rock formations cast weird shadows. Sometimes, the sun just happens to shine through a crevice. But the more examples pile up, the more the weight shifts. coincidence starts to feel like a stretch, especially when the same symbols, spirals, concentric circles, serpents, humanoid figures are found at many of these locations, carved into walls exactly where the light hits, exactly when it matters. And then there's the matter of the missing written record. These cultures, Fremont, ancestral, Puebloan, archaic, left no texts, no stone tablets explaining their intentions, no codices listing astronomical charts. All we have are symbols, alignments, the behavior of light on stone, which makes these sites a kind of reverse language, meaning inferred from geometry, belief inferred from architecture. It leads to unsettling questions. Were these dwellings part of larger ritual calendars? Were communities moving in sync with the sky? Did they believe time itself flowed through the walls of their homes? Some archaeologists suggest these alignments were practical, a way to track planting and harvesting seasons. Others believe they were spiritual, marking holy days or celestial events tied to myth. Still others propose a psychological function, placing people in tune with cycles bigger than themselves, living inside a calendar rather than outside of one. But maybe the most unsettling possibility is that these alignments weren't just observational. Maybe they were invitations, openings, places where the veil between sky and stone, earth and heaven, thinned just enough for someone to glimpse something beyond. Because when you walk into a stone chamber where the light only enters once a year, and it strikes a carved spiral just as the stars rise behind you, you feel it. Something ancient, intentional, unexplained. And this intentionality doesn't stop with architecture. Scattered across the desert, far from any village or dwelling, are roots and cairns, arranged in baffling lines, paths carved into nothing, markers pointing nowhere. But maybe, just maybe, those alignments weren't meant for the living at all. Mysterious transportation routes, or cairns, carved in remote desert terrains. There are roads in Utah that don't go anywhere. Not modern roads, these predate wheels. Narrow footpaths worn into stone, straight lines etched across valleys. Cairns stacked in deliberate formations, sometimes miles apart, marking the way for no one in particular. And unlike the modern grid of highways and GPS lines we take for granted, these paths feel almost anti-human. They obey no logic of topography. They go up where it's hard, around where it's flat, and vanish entirely where they should most obviously exist. They're transportation routes. Probably. Maybe. At least, that's the word archaeologists use when they don't want to say we have no idea what these were for. Found primarily in Utah's canyonlands and desert plateaus, particularly in areas near Bears Ears, Comb Ridge, and the Escalante Wilderness, these roads or linear alignments appear as trails so faint that satellite imagery sometimes sees them better than the human eye. Aerial scans have revealed long, deliberate lines, some nearly straight for miles, cutting across sandstone and sagebrush like forgotten signatures. They connect nothing that we can identify. No settlements, no known water sources, no consistent endpoints. What they do connect, however, is more unsettling. Certain rock art sites, isolated cairns, high-altitude granaries. And, in a few strange cases, nothing at all. Just a clearing in the desert that feels oddly intentional. The cairns are equally strange. They're not large enough to serve as burial markers. They don't hide anything inside. They aren't defensive. And yet they're not random. Each stack a few rocks, balanced carefully, suggests purpose. Wayfinding, perhaps. Or ritual. Or message. If you stand between two cairns and look forward, sometimes you'll see a third, directly in line. And sometimes you won't. That's the thing. The patterns don't always hold. Just when you think you're following logic, the logic disappears. Some researchers propose that these alignments mark seasonal migration routes. Others suggest they were ceremonial, maybe pathways for processions or pilgrimage. The problem is that, like the petroglyphs and solar alignments, They come without context. No writings, no signs, just the residual geometry of vanished behavior. There's a theory quietly circulated in academic corners that these paths may have served symbolic purposes, that walking them was part of a spiritual journey. Not about reaching a destination, but about following a line that mirrored the stars, or the underworld, or something we don't even have the cultural framework to understand. And it's not just Utah. Similar road systems have been found in Chaco Canyon, where wide roads connect ancient ruins across vast distances. Some are 30 feet wide, perfectly straight, and led into open desert. No destination, just a line. One of the most famous, the Great North Road, leads away from Chaco toward the unknown, flanked by occasional staircases carved into rock, built to maintain the road's sacred linearity rather than follow the land's natural contours. Utah's roads don't have that scale, but the intention feels familiar. The defiance of landscape, the insistence on direction, the refusal to explain. Even today, hikers sometimes stumble upon these features, cairns without trails, paths without footprints, and feel the eerie tug of being watched or followed, as if the path itself remembers being walked and is waiting for someone to do it again. And maybe that's what they were always for. Not practical routes, not messages, but instructions for reenactment, paths to be walked for their own sake, not because they take you somewhere, but because they remind you that you once belonged somewhere, or that you're trying to. And if these alignments whisper to the stars, then what about the carvings beneath them? Because scattered throughout southern Utah are inscriptions that don't align with anything language, art style, or known history. They're isolated, they're stubborn, and some of them don't resemble any symbols we've ever documented. Isolated cliff inscriptions with undefined symbols scattered across southern Utah. On certain canyon walls in southern Utah, usually the ones you don't find in guidebooks, you'll sometimes see something that doesn't make sense. Not just in the usual, wow, ancient people were different kind of way, but in the deeper, more unsettling sense of, what culture made this? What were they trying to say? And why is no one talking about it? These are the isolated cliff inscriptions, single lines of symbols, short bursts of geometric code, carvings that don't resemble Fremont, Ute, ancestral Puebloan, or even Spanish colonial markings. No familiar figures, no bighorn sheep, no spirals, just strange glyphs, lines within lines, hooks, sharp angles, impossible to pronounce symmetries etched in solitude. Some appear to be deliberate sequences, others look like experiments abandoned mid-thought, and the most disturbing ones, they repeat. That is, the same undefined symbols have been found miles apart, carved into completely separate canyons, with no cultural or temporal link between them. The rock types are different. The exposure is different. The weathering is different. But the symbols? Identical. There's no scholarly consensus on who made them. A few fringe researchers argue they predate known indigenous cultures, citing weathering patterns and tool marks inconsistent with later peoples. Others suggest post-contact origins, possibly coded messages left by early explorers or settlers, but those explanations fall apart under scrutiny. The symbols aren't letters, they aren't numbers, and they're never accompanied by anything recognizably human, no animals, no hunting scenes, no context clues at all. In some places, they're deeply etched, as if meant to endure. In others, they're faint, almost hidden, like someone wanted them found, but only by the right eyes. What kind of message works like that? There's also the geography. These inscriptions aren't located near water sources, trails, or known campgrounds. Some are found on sheer vertical walls, reachable only by climbing. Others are near cave entrances, sometimes directly above them, like a warning or a signature. A few theories, none of them proven, propose that the symbols may have astronomical significance, that they mark certain constellations or celestial events. But even that breaks down when you realize the symbols don't match any known sky maps, indigenous or otherwise. They're not constellations. They're not mathematical. They're not art in any conventional sense. They're just messages without a sender. And the silence around them is deafening. Unlike Fremont art or Ute panels, which are cataloged and studied, these inscriptions are rarely published. They show up in old field journals, fringe books, and grainy photographs passed around by amateur explorers. Some were destroyed before they could be documented. Others were simply lost again, erased by erosion, vandalism, or indifference. Which begs the question, who's erasing them and why? Is it because they don't fit? Because they don't align with the clean timeline we like to draw from past to present? Maybe we're not ignoring these symbols because they mean nothing. Maybe we're ignoring them because they mean something, and that something doesn't have a category yet. The desert is patient. It doesn't rush to explain itself, and these symbols, whatever they once meant, are part of its long memory. But if these were meant as warnings or messages for future travelers, the real question isn't who carved them. It's who they were carved for. And just around the bend, deep in canyon walls that never see full daylight, that same sense of misfit purpose continues in stone chambers hidden underground, built by no known hand for no known use. Underground stone chambers in remote canyons with no clear origin. Deep in the forgotten folds of Utah's canyon, country places where the roads end not with fences but with silence. You'll occasionally stumble upon something stranger than silence, a room where no room should be. These are the underground stone chambers. Roughly built, partially buried, constructed into hillsides, or tucked beneath rock shelves, or carved into canyon walls like forgotten vaults. They're not numerous. They're not even well documented. But they do exist, found in areas near Capitol Reef, San Rafael Swell, and parts of the Escalante Wilderness. And they all raise the same quiet question. Who built these, and why? They aren't mines. There are no tool marks suggesting ore extraction, and no signs of mineral seams that would justify the effort. They aren't natural caves. Either the stones forming the walls are fitted together in unmistakably human fashion, often with dry stacking techniques that echo the masonry seen in Fremont or ancestral Puebloan architecture, and yet, somehow, don't quite match it. No pottery shards, no fire pits, no art, no offerings, just a space, sometimes rectangular, sometimes circular, always enclosed, always facing, nothing in particular. If these were dwellings, they're oddly Spartan. If they were storage spaces, there's no trace of stored goods, no seeds, no ash layers, no bones, no midden heaps. And if they were ceremonial, the absence of symbolic markers is deafening. There are no spirals on the walls, no footprints in the dust, just stone, shadow, and unanswered intent. Some of the chambers are barely large enough to crouch in. Others could accommodate a handful of people. And all of them are inconvenient, difficult to access, hidden from trails, often in places where visibility is low and the sun never quite reaches. They seem designed for seclusion, even avoidance. One particularly well-constructed example, in a tributary of the Dirty Devil River, shows signs of having been deliberately sealed at some point in the distant past. The entrance was blocked with stacked stones, packed tightly, no clear reason why. When the barrier was removed by curious hikers, the chamber inside was empty, bone-dry, featureless. Archaeologists have offered a few tentative classifications, cold storage, temporary shelters, maybe even root cellars. But the truth is, most of these sites don't fit any known typology. They're outliers. Anomalies. The kind of things that get written up in early excavation reports with a sentence or two, then quietly ignored. Because how do you categorize a room with no history? Some alternative theories abound, as they always do. One suggests that the chambers may have been constructed as vision quest, spaces sealed environments for ritual isolation. Another posits they were hiding places, perhaps for people, or objects, or knowledge. Then there's the more poetic theory, that they were never meant for the living, but built as tombs for ideas. but no human remains have been found in them. No tools, no signs of use. Just chambers. You get the sense that whoever built them didn't want them found, or perhaps didn't care if they were. And it gets stranger. In a handful of cases, these chambers appear in areas where there's no other evidence of long-term habitation. No nearby granaries, no water source, no trail network, nothing that ties them into a known cultural footprint. Like punctuation marks in the desert, detached from any sentence. Which brings up a darker possibility. Maybe these structures don't fit because they're not supposed to. Maybe they weren't built by any of the cultures we've been studying. Maybe they were built before. Before what? Exactly. Before the Fremont? Before the Archaic period? Before memory? And if you think that sounds too vague to be unsettling, wait until you realize these chambers aren't the only things in Utah's deserts that don't belong. Dig deep enough, and you'll find objects, tools, fragments, designs that don't fit any cultural profile we currently recognize. Things that look like they were made with purpose, but for no known people. Unidentified artifact types unearthed in digs that defy known cultural classification. Not every artifact comes with a name tag. Most don't even come with context. In Utah's desert, digs particularly in places like Danger Cave, Hogup Cave, Range Creek, and lesser-known sites across the Great Basin and Colorado Plateau, archaeologists have uncovered objects that simply shouldn't be there. Not because they're too advanced, not because they're too primitive, but because they don't belong to any known pattern. They are orphans, driftwood on the tide of history. Some are stone tools, but shaped wrong blades with no logical hafting point, grooves where none are needed, edges that appear worn but in ways inconsistent with cutting, scraping, or drilling. Others are worked bone or antler pieces that resemble awls or needles, but are far too thick or short to serve that function. There are even a few groundstone artifacts that appear polished, but have no clear use for grinding. No starch residue, no wear patterns. Just shaped things, tactile enigmas. And it gets weirder. In one Fremont-era context, a dig near Capitol Reef unearthed a small ceramic object, roughly the size of a child's fist, covered in dot and line markings. It resembled no known vessel, pipe, or figurine. There was no residue, no burn marks, no fracture indicating it had been broken from a larger piece. It had been placed upright in a pit lined with charcoal, but not burned. When archaeologists ran it through every known typology, it returned 0 matches, so they wrote it off as ritualistic. That's academic shorthand for we don't know, but it probably mattered. At another site near the Sevier River, a pile of what looked like flattened discs of stone were found buried in a shallow trench. Each one was roughly the same diameter, but varied wildly in thickness and composition: sandstone, quartzite, basalt. They weren't beads, they weren't game pieces. They weren't functional in any way anyone could determine. Some had faint notches on the edges, others were perfectly smooth. None of them were explainable. In many cases, these artifacts get cataloged, photographed, and filed away. The reports mention them briefly. Sometimes they're labeled as miscellaneous or non-diagnostic. They vanish into storage drawers and digital databases, waiting for someone to find a matching piece. Sometimes that happens. Usually, it doesn't. Because they don't match anything. And here's the uncomfortable part. Some of these artifacts are everywhere. Spread across sites hundreds of miles apart. Same shape, same weirdness, different materials, different dates. No culture seems to claim them. No toolkit seems to require them. But they keep showing up, quietly, persistently. It's as if there was another system of knowledge once, another set of practices, maybe even beliefs, that simply didn't survive. No stories, no names, just traces. Like notes from a forgotten instrument, still echoing in the dirt. Which leads to a quietly haunting possibility. Maybe our entire picture of prehistory is skewed not because of what we know, but because of what we keep discarding. Maybe some cultures weren't lost. Maybe they were simply edited out, one unclassified object at a time. And those objects, strange and unclaimed, are still here, still surfacing. The land remembers, even when we don't. Mysterious stone, alignments in plateau areas that some hypothesize were ceremonial. In the wide, flat plateaus of central and southern Utah, where wind carves the silence sharper than stone, and even time seems reluctant to settle, there are places where the rocks don't feel random. Not scattered, not tumbled, not the usual erosion. Instead, they sit in patterns, linear, concentric, deliberate. These are the stone alignments, rows of rocks, low walls, circles, and sometimes geometric formations found in remote stretches of mesa and high desert terrain. They're too subtle to draw tourists, too strange to be shelters, and too specific to be accidents, and no one can quite explain what they were for. Some are barely visible from the ground, small cobbles placed edge to edge, tracing a curve or running in a dead straight line across a barren plateau. Others only reveal their full design when seen from above. A circle here, a spiral there, a long row of stones pointing directly at the horizon, terminating in nothing, just open sky. Archaeologists have recorded them sparsely. Some are listed in site registries, often marked function unknown. Others exist only in aerial photography or the notebooks of curious hikers. Because once you know what to look for, they start appearing in the strangest places. And while they don't match the scale or engineering of structures like the Nazca Lines or Stonehenge, they carry the same unsettling suggestion. Someone put these here on purpose, to do something we don't understand. One theory is ceremonial function, that these alignments were part of seasonal rituals, perhaps tracking solstices or harvests or migrations. In a land without permanent architecture, laying stones in place may have been a way to anchor meaning, a sacred space created through labor and geometry. Support for this idea comes from a few tantalizing alignments. In one instance, a long line of stones on a bluff above the San Rafael swell points almost exactly to the winter solstice sunrise. Another points to a notch between two distant mesas where the sun sets during the summer solstice. Coincidence? Maybe. But they're not random. These rocks were carried and placed. Some weigh more than 30 pounds. Others had to be hauled up steep inclines. There's no utility here. No defensive position, no farming advantage, just placement. A few of the circular formations resemble medicine wheels found in the northern plains structures associated with ritual and cosmology, but Utah's versions lack the radial symmetry. They're rougher, more intuitive. Some are interrupted halfway through, as if the builders left before completing the design, or were interrupted by something else. Weather, conflict, or the slow collapse of memory. Another theory is that these alignments were social markers designating clan territories, hunting boundaries, or meeting points. This might explain why many of them are located at elevated vantage points. But again, no artifacts accompany the stones. No tools, no food remains, no fire pits. Just alignment, geometry, and silence. Perhaps the most haunting theory is that these were grave markers not for individuals, but for ideas, that the alignments commemorated stories now lost, encoded into stone when words proved insufficient or unspeakable. A physical myth, told across the land, in a dialect of rock and direction. And then there's the possibility we don't want to touch, that these structures represent a cognitive framework we simply don't share, that the builders saw landscape differently, felt time differently, understood place and memory in ways we no longer do. Which would mean we're not looking at broken maps. We're looking at a language that never needed translation until it was forgotten. The land, of course, doesn't care if we understand. The rocks keep pointing, And if you follow their direction, sometimes you stumble onto something even more unsettling. Like the time someone found what looked like animal footprints carved, not pressed into solid rock. Strange carved footprints, or animal prints in rock. Origin story, unclear. It's one of those things that makes you pause mid-step. You're hiking a dry wash, or climbing across slick rock, when your eye catches something that looks like a footprint, not a fossil, not a depression, a carving. A precise, symmetrical imprint of a foot or a paw chiseled into stone. You lean closer. It's smooth, deliberate. The toes are defined. The heel curves. It's not erosion. It's not a weathered pothole. Someone made this. Then you see another one. And another. Sometimes they appear in pairs, like someone walked across the rock and vanished into time. Other times, they're isolated, one lonely print carved into a boulder, as if to say, someone was here, but no one knows who. These mysterious carved footprints have been found sporadically across southern Utah, especially in remote stretches near Bears Ears, the Escalante River, and parts of Capitol Reef. Some are human in shape. Others appear animal canine, feline, or hoofed. None are accompanied by other carvings. No names, no dates, no figures, just the mark, the trace. And they are not fossilized prints. They're not remnants of creatures that stepped into mud 150 million years ago and were preserved by time. These are incised, too symmetrical, too stylized. They belong not to paleontology, but to mystery. Most of them don't appear on maps or in archaeological databases. They're treated like curiosities, possibly modern, likely ceremonial, unclassified. The language gets evasive, like no one wants to take ownership of the fact that someone carved a perfect footprint into bedrock and didn't leave a single word about why. Some local traditions, especially among Ute and Navajo elders, associate such carvings with spirit journeys. A footprint may mark the site of a vision, or the place where a shaman crossed into the other world. It's not a trail. It's a threshold. Others interpret the prints as markers of presence, territorial or ancestral, like a signature carved in stone by someone who wasn't trying to be remembered, but recorded nonetheless. There's also a more unsettling interpretation, that these carvings aren't about the past at all. They're about repetition. That the footprint marks a spot where something happens, again and again, on a loop we don't recognize, a site where reality thins, where people pass through, even if we don't see them. Most archaeologists shy away from these theories. They focus on typologies, context, provenance, and these carvings resist all three. They're often isolated, found on exposed slick rock, with no surrounding artifacts. No dwellings, no hearths, just stone and sky. A few have been documented in more detail. One notable example near the Escalante River shows a series of 4 prints, each spaced roughly a stride apart, running in a straight line across a tilted slab of sandstone. They face west. They lead to a cliff edge. There is no continuation. It's not the kind of mystery that fits in a paper. It doesn't belong in a thesis. It's too symbolic, too personal, too poetic. And that's exactly why it persists. Because once you see one of these carvings, just one, you start looking at the ground differently. You start asking questions the land isn't prepared to answer. And you begin to wonder, if this was left for someone, was it you? Not every artifact has to be deciphered. Some are meant to echo. And echo they do into burial sites just beyond the cliffs, where bodies were laid with patterns we no longer recognize, in graves shallower than expected, among customs we can't quite identify. You're absolutely right. Thank you for the correction. Let's continue in strict sequence. Below are the next 2 segments in the correct order, beginning with ancient wooden or fiber remains, whose function is still not known. In most archaeological digs across Utah, wood and fiber don't last long enough to be mysterious. Organic materials decay fast under the desert sun or disintegrate into dust when exposed to the air after centuries of burial. And yet against all odds, a strange collection of wooden and fiber artifacts has survived, tucked away in dry caves, buried under layers of protective sediment, or sealed in conditions so specific that they kept the natural world out just long enough for us to find something we still don't understand. The problem? We don't know what these things are. From Danger Cave near Wendover to Hogup Cave and lesser-known sites across the Great Basin and Colorado Plateau, archaeologists have recovered wooden tools, woven fiber pieces, and shaped organic objects that don't clearly match any known category of prehistoric material culture. These items aren't weapons. They're not tools in the conventional sense. They're not clothing. They're not containers. They are something else. One of the most puzzling examples is a series of carved wooden rods, some wrapped in fiber, some burned at one end, others smooth as driftwood, but bearing no signs of utility, no notches, no grooves for handles, no evidence of striking or scraping. They're too light to be weapons, too refined to be kindling, too contextless to be interpreted with confidence. Then there are the bundles. Some digs have uncovered tight coils of twisted fiber, often made from juniper bark or willow, sometimes coated in resins or ash, sometimes stained with unidentifiable pigments. A few have wooden cores. A few don't. None have confirmed uses. Some resemble components of traps. Others look like ceremonial bundles, though without associated objects or markings. It's hard to say whether they were practical, symbolic, or both. One set of artifacts from Cowboy Cave, near Horseshoe Canyon, includes delicate netting made from plant fibers. Too fine for fishing, too coarse for clothing, not large enough for a carrying bag. The weave is sophisticated, intentional, and once again, completely undefined. In another case, a dig revealed a wooden forked stick about 2 feet long with a perfect symmetrical Y shape and carefully polished ends. No signs of wear, no lashings, no attached materials. It wasn't used to stir anything. It wasn't burned. It's not even clear if it was ever held. It was just placed there. Found alongside stone tools and animal remains, but offering no clear relationship to either. Some of these objects have been carbon dated to over 7,000 years old, predating most known sedentary cultures in the region, which raises a deeper question. Were these tools from an undocumented tradition? A lost technology? Or are we simply misreading their context because they don't match our modern categories of function? Archaeologists, to their credit, don't jump to conclusions. Most label these items as non-diagnostic organic artifacts, which is a polite way of saying, we don't know, but we're pretending this doesn't keep us up at night. Occasionally, a theory emerges. Maybe the rods were fire starters, part of a friction-based ignition system. Maybe the fiber bundles were amulets. Maybe the Y-shaped sticks were animal snares, signal devices, or tools for harvesting something we've forgotten how to use. But all of those theories are undermined by a lack of pattern. The items don't show up in consistent locations. They're not common enough to suggest widespread use. They don't evolve over time. And they never show up with clear evidence of ritual, domestic, or hunting contexts. They just appear and disappear. And perhaps most unsettling of all, some of them look intentional, as if they were made not to be used, but to be preserved, kept, hidden, left behind with care, but without explanation. Which is its own kind of message, isn't it? Maybe not everything was built to serve a purpose we can measure. Maybe some things were made just to be found centuries later by people with the wrong questions. And in the very same layers where these artifacts were unearthed, other discoveries complicate the story even further. Burials wrapped in woven mats, rigid poses, shallow pits, traditions we can't pin down. Because the people who left these objects also left their dead in ways that still resist interpretation, and among those bodies, in those quiet graves, the desert has preserved another contradiction. Unusual burial practices, found in shallow graves context and tradition. Unclear. In the margins of Utah's archaeological map between canyon overhangs, scrubland hollows, and the gravelly floors of high desert valleys there lie graves. Not monumental ones. Not the kind you mark with standing stones or mounds of earth. Just depressions in the ground, so shallow you could miss them if you weren't looking. So deliberate you can't ignore them once you know. These are the forgotten burials, the ones that don't follow the rules. Most indigenous cultures of the ancient Southwest had recognizable burial traditions, flexed positions, certain orientations, specific grave goods, but these graves found across Utah don't follow any of them consistently. Some are fetal, some are sprawled, some are crammed into natural rock crevices, others lie beneath layers of flat stones. A few disturbingly were placed in locations where erosion would inevitably expose them to the elements. And yet, they persist. Quiet, unmoving, out of step with everything we think we know. What's missing is just as strange as what's present. Many of these graves contain no grave goods at all. No offerings, no beads, no tools, no ceramics, in some cases, no clothing remnants. Just the body, alone, in earth that doesn't speak. Other burials go the opposite direction, overwhelming specificity. A jawbone from an animal placed in the hands, a large unworked rock on the chest, a bundle of tightly coiled plant fiber tucked beside the skull. None of these objects match known patterns. They're not part of documented rituals. They don't carry obvious symbolic weight. They just exist. One burial in the Escalante region featured two individuals laid head to foot, separated by a wall of upright stones, as if they were meant to be buried together but apart. Another, found in the Green River Basin, had a child's remains partially wrapped in a woven mat, but without any other signs of care. No shelter from the wind, no depth to the grave. Just a shallow depression in the sand. The radiocarbon dates are all over the place, some graves stretching back 5,000 years, others barely 1,000. Some belong to identified cultural phases, others fall between them. But across that entire spectrum, one thing is constant. They don't make sense. Researchers have speculated everything from emergency burials, deaths during famine, conflict or migration to cultural outliers, lone individuals with no ties to community. Others suggest these are liminal graves deaths that occurred under unusual circumstances, where the standard burial rites weren't allowed or were intentionally denied. But even those theories fall apart when confronted with the sheer number and spread of these graves. They're not unique enough to be flukes, and they're not similar enough to be part of a known system. They're just there, waiting. And whatever the reason behind their shallow depth, their isolation, their absence of tradition, the desert keeps them. It always does. Perhaps they were laid to rest in a time when rules were changing, or in a moment when the world stopped making sense and the living simply had to improvise something that looked like memory. Or maybe, just maybe, these burials were messages, not to the gods, not to each other, but to us. Look what you forgot! And what comes next on this trail of forgotten knowledge are patterns of living that shouldn't have worked at all. Stone terraces built on the edge of collapse, coaxing life out of the driest corners of the desert. Not survival, not settlement, something stranger, something we're still trying to read. Evidence of ancient agricultural terraces in improbable arid zones. In a landscape where the ground crackles underfoot and the sky forgets how to rain, something unexpected waits. Rows of stones carefully placed, gently sloping, tiered like steps leading nowhere. They climb the edges of steep hillsides, hug the curves of mesas, and stretch across desolate inclines where even sagebrush thinks twice. These are the agricultural terraces, built by someone in places where agriculture shouldn't exist. The idea of farming in ancient Utah isn't surprising in itself. The Fremont, ancestral Puebloans, and later indigenous cultures all practiced agriculture to some degree: maize, squash, beans. But their fields were usually close to rivers, seeps, or floodplains, logical places, efficient. You plant where the water goes. But the terraces? They're not in those places. They're high on exposed ridges, tucked into the dry, skeletal flanks of desert hills, sometimes far from any known settlement or water source. No irrigation channels, no nearby granaries. No proof that anyone lived there. Just stones and slope, shaped into a logic we haven't cracked. What's especially strange is how refined some of these terraces are. The stones aren't just tossed together, they're arranged. Flat faces turned outward, supporting earthen beds behind them. In some places, multiple terraces stack atop one another in sequence. You don't do that for fun. That's labor, repetition, intention. Pollen analysis at a few sites suggests maize and amaranth may have been grown here, though the evidence is sparse and often complicated by centuries of erosion. In some terraces, there are microscopic residues consistent with cultivated soil, crushed bone, ash, bits of charcoal. In others, nothing but wind-blown sediment. So why build them? One theory is that these terraces were experimental test plots used by early agriculturalists trying to adapt farming techniques to new microclimates. Another idea is that they weren't for food at all, but for ritual plants, tobacco, medicinal herbs, or psychotropic species used in ceremony. There's also a more symbolic interpretation, that these terraces weren't meant to produce crops consistently, but to fulfill ceremonial obligations, offerings to the earth, stone-lined prayers. What complicates all of this is the lack of consistent dating. Some terraces appear to be over 1,000 years old, others perhaps only 600. A few are undatable, too weathered, too isolated, too ambiguous. Some researchers have proposed that these sites may have been reused or rebuilt by multiple groups over time, but without stratified artifacts, it's impossible to confirm. And yet the phenomenon isn't isolated. Similar terraces exist in parts of northern Arizona, western Colorado, and New Mexico. But Utah's versions are more remote, more severe, less explainable. In some areas, like the Kaiparowitz Plateau, the terraces overlook nothing, no valleys, no water sources, no ancient roads. They face open desert, the edge of emptiness. Some barely retain enough soil to support a weed. So either they were built during a wetter climatic phase, or they were never meant to be efficient. Which brings us back to the central paradox. Too much effort, not enough reward. Why carry rocks uphill, build walls, trap sediment, and shape terraces in a place that barely holds on to life? The answer may lie in belief, in the possibility that these weren't farms, they were declarations, statements of persistence, or hope, or defiance. A refusal to let the land dictate what could grow. And if that's true, it tells us something quietly profound about the people who built them, that their survival wasn't just practical, it was philosophical. They were trying to live, yes, but they were also trying to belong, to participate in the shaping of a landscape that didn't particularly care whether they succeeded. And sometimes, that's what civilization is, not what you grow, but what you build while trying. Just beyond some of these terraces, etched into canyon walls where the light rarely touches, another mystery unfolds. Figures in red and black, painted with masked faces, wide eyes, and impossible expressions. They're watching, and we still don't know what they mean. Pictographs with masked figures. Symbolism remains uncertain. If Utah's petroglyphs are carvings from memory, then its pictographs are paintings from dream. And among the most haunting of these are the masked figures, humanoid shapes painted in red ochre, black charcoal, and sometimes white or yellow mineral pigments, their faces obscured by exaggerated masks, wide eyes, hollow mouths, or otherworldly headdresses that look more insect than human. They stare out from rock panels like forgotten gods, or prisoners. The most iconic examples belong to what's known as the Barrier Canyon style, a visual tradition dating back at least 1,000 to 4,000 years, depending on which expert you ask. Found mostly in central and southeastern Utah canyonlands, Horseshoe Canyon, the San Rafael Swell, these pictographs are not narrative. They don't tell a story in the way we expect. Instead, they confront. Towering figures, some over 7 feet tall, stand motionless in rows or clusters. Their bodies are elongated, often faceless or mask-like. Some float, some merge into abstract patterns. A few are surrounded by smaller figures, animals, humans, shapes that seem to orbit them like moons. And then there are the masks. Not all figures are masked, but those that are draw the most attention. Their faces are stylized, circular eyes, antennae-like projections, snouts, teeth, grids, dots. Some resemble gas masks. Others evoke owls, or mantises, or skulls. The effect is unnerving. What are we looking at? Shamans, spirits, aliens, gods, ancestors? No one knows. There are no written records associated with the Barrier Canyon style, no oral traditions that explain it. Later, tribes Ute, Paiute, Navajo acknowledged the art, but claimed no authorship. The paintings predate their memory, which is unsettling in its own right, a forgotten culture whose only surviving language is pigment on stone. Some archaeologists believe these figures are shamanic visions recorded during trance states, possibly induced by fasting or natural hallucinogens. The masks, in this view, represent altered identities, spiritual intermediaries, or supernatural beings encountered during journeys into other realms. Others argue that the masked figures represent literal beings, mythic ancestors, clan spirits, or cosmological archetypes. A more esoteric theory? The paintings record visitors, beings not from this world, or at least not from this layer of it, masked because they were unrecognizable, distant, powerful, and not necessarily benevolent. Skeptics roll their eyes, of course, but they still can't explain the masks. Nor can they explain the consistency. Masked figures show up at multiple sites, separated by miles and centuries. And while each is unique, the themes repeat: elongation, facial distortion, symbolic body shapes, alignment with other symbols like serpents, concentric circles, and winged forms. The paint used in these pictographs was carefully prepared. Ochre mixed with binders, blood, egg, plant resins, applied with brushes, fingers, reed sticks. In some cases, the surfaces were prepped, smoothed, ground down. These weren't casual doodles. They were planned, performed. And the masks? They were part of the performance. Were they hiding something? Revealing it? Were they meant to be terrifying? Reverent? Protective? The figures never explain. They just look back. And maybe that's the point, that they weren't meant to be understood, only witnessed. But even that fragile relationship is under threat. Sunlight, rain, and vandalism are erasing the faces faster than we can study them. Soon, the masked figures may be gone, and all we'll have left is the silence where meaning used to be. But not far from their watchful gaze, another silence waits inside. Caves layered with ash and charcoal, evidence of ancient fires no one has quite managed to date. Fires that may have burned long before anyone was supposed to be here. Fires that still refuse to explain what, exactly, was being burned, or why. Layers of ash or charcoal in caves, whose origins and timeframes are undated. Walk into one of Utah's ancient caves, and you might find silence layered in soot. Not the kind left by a casual campfire, not the trace of a lone traveler's warm night. No, these are deep, deliberate deposits. Layers of ash and charcoal, feet thick in some places, compressed under centuries of sediment. Evidence not just of a single fire, but of many, or of something that burned for a long time. And yet, In many of these caves, we don't know when the burning happened or why. Danger Cave, Hogup Cave, Cowboy Cave. Names that sound like something out of Pulp Fiction, but are instead full of real, unsettling ambiguity. Caves where ash piles mingle with fragmented bones, broken tools, fiber scraps, and other residues of life lived half in shadow. What's strange isn't just that things were burned, it's that we can't figure out what was burned or why it mattered. In some cases, the charcoal layers are sterile, devoid of associated tools, food remains, or organic material. No ash-encrusted baskets, no burnt seeds, no cooking stones or fire-cracked rock. Just blackened layers, pressed like pages into the sediment. Other times, the layers are mixed with bizarre artifacts, carved wood, odd bone shapes, or bundled fiber fragments, charred at the edges as if they'd been placed in the fire for symbolic reasons. Or perhaps accidental reasons. But in nearly every case, something is missing. A pattern. The kind of consistent ritual, domestic or economic context that allows archaeologists to say, "Ah, yes, this was cooking," or "this was a trash pit." Instead, they're left with phrases like unidentified combustion feature or undated ash concentration, which is just a more polite way of saying, we have no idea what they were doing in here, but they did it a lot. And dating these layers is notoriously difficult. Radiocarbon tests return wide ranges, samples contaminated by mineral leaching, groundwater, or later disturbances. A single layer of ash might contain material from 5 different centuries. A fire pit might rest atop a hearth from 1,000 years earlier, both compacted into the same matrix. Time in these caves doesn't flow, it pools. In some sites, the ash layers are neatly bounded, contained within stone circles, sometimes even lined with clay or charred bark. That suggests structure, intent. These weren't just survival fires. They were events, possibly rituals, possibly repeated performances, the kind of thing people would travel to participate in. In other sites, the charcoal is more chaotic, scattered, wind-blown, seemingly abandoned mid-use. The ashes mingle with rodent burrows, insect nests, and the roots of desert plants that have crept in through cracks. Human presence swallowed back into the land. What's most disorienting is that these layers show up where no one should have been lighting fires, in caves too far from water, too cramped for sleeping, too remote for regular visitation. Yet someone went there, again and again, and made fire. Why? One hypothesis is spiritual cleansing, that these fires were meant to purify not food, not space, but memory, burn the old, make room for something else. But that's just a guess. Another theory is that they were smoke signals, not the kind used to send messages across hills, but symbolic ones fire lit in the belly of the earth to communicate with something unseen, the cave as a throat. The smoke is a voice, the silence afterward is the only reply. Whatever the purpose, the evidence endures. The layers are there, compressed like dreams you can't quite remember but know were important. You dig, and the black bands appear like scars in the earth, each one a story, each one unfinished. And tucked into those same caves, sometimes in those very layers, are objects that seem to not belong at all. Seashells from distant coasts, foreign materials that should have been impossible to transport. Which leads to another impossible question. How did they get there? Exotic material artifacts, like seashells, found in interior sites. Source unknown. In the high desert canyons of Utah, where the land looks like it forgot the ocean ever existed, there are seashells. Not fossilized remnants of some ancient inland sea, though there are plenty of those too. No, these are transported shells, cleaned, polished, drilled. Left behind in caves, alcoves, and burial sites hundreds of miles from the nearest coastline, carried, somehow, by hands we can't trace. They show up unexpectedly, in midden layers at sites with no evidence of long-distance trade, in ceremonial contexts without a known ritual framework, in storage pits that contain no food. You dig through layers of local stone tools, bones from jackrabbit and mule deer, pottery shards covered in familiar Fremont patterns, and then, Barrett Island, a shell from the Pacific. Or sometimes, even stranger, the Gulf of Mexico. Most of the shells are small beads, pendants, or unmodified fragments, but their presence is a contradiction. Utah is landlocked, harsh, bordered by mountains and deserts. And yet, over and over again, these oceanic objects appear in places they have no business being. A few sites contain Olivella shell beads native to California, others have conus shells from further south. And in some truly bizarre finds, archaeologists have uncovered marine shell types native to the Gulf Coast, over 1,000 miles away. This has led to some familiar hypotheses. The most comfortable one, trade. That these shells were passed hand to hand down the line of tribes and settlements until they reached the Utah interior. Evidence of vast trade networks stretching from the Pacific to the Colorado Plateau, functioning long before wheels or written records. A prehistoric Silk Road, a kind of cultural relay race. It's possible, somewhat supported by other traded goods, turquoise, obsidian, copper, but the problem is context. In most cases, these shells don't show up alongside other trade items. No bundles of goods, no caches, no evidence of exchange hubs, just a shell, alone, out of place, like someone brought it with them not to trade, but to keep, or bury, or leave. Sometimes the shells are clearly modified, drilled for stringing, etched with patterns, possibly jewelry, possibly status markers, but other times they're unworked, raw, natural. No sign of human alteration, just a perfect ocean shell in the middle of the desert. And that complicates the narrative, because unmodified shells aren't valuable for trade, they're not useful, they're symbolic, carried for meaning, not economy. So what did they mean? Water, perhaps, life, movement, a world beyond the desert, a piece of the infinite, held in a land defined by limits. Or maybe they were talismans, tokens from journeys, or gifts from strangers whose names were never passed down, beings not remembered in folklore because they didn't fit the folklore. One theory, whispered more than spoken, suggests that some of these objects were brought by outsiders, people who crossed the desert, not as traders, but as anomalies. Travelers who left no record except the artifacts that don't belong. That's not a comfortable idea. It doesn't map well onto the clean lines of migration and diffusion that populate textbooks. But these shells aren't asking to be understood. They're asking to be noticed. They suggest a kind of memory not recorded in language, but in object, movement, placement. The kind of memory that survives because it doesn't explain itself. And it raises a chilling thought. If shells can travel thousands of miles and still remain unclaimed, how many other things have crossed these deserts and left no trace but confusion? Because these aren't the only artifacts that defy category. All across Utah, stone tools show up that don't belong to any known cultural type. They're shaped, they're functional, they're real. But they don't match anything else. They're just here. Stone tools with unusual shapes that don't match typologies of known cultures. They show up like echoes in scattered dig sites, eroded rock shelters, and long abandoned middens across Utah's prehistoric landscapes, stone tools that don't seem to follow any known logic of design. They're chipped, shaped, and sharpened, clearly worked by human hands, and yet they don't resemble anything in the catalog. No familiar point styles, no standardized forms, no diagnostic edges or grooves that would allow an archaeologist to confidently say, "This is a scraper," or "That's a projectile point." Instead, they just exist sitting awkwardly at the intersection of function and ambiguity. These tools aren't crude either. Many are beautifully made. Fine retouching, precise snapping, patterns of flake scars that suggest a practiced hand. Someone knew what they were doing. They just weren't doing it the way anyone else was. The first time you see one in person, it looks wrong. Not because it's alien or advanced, this isn't the stuff of science fiction, but because it doesn't fit the typology. And if archaeology has one comfort zone, it's typology. Clovis, Folsom, desert side notched, Fremont, triangular, everything in its box, everything with a label. These tools refuse the box. Instead of classic leaf-shaped blades or notched dart points, you get asymmetrical shapes, tools with 3 or 4 working edges, bulbous ends without hafting areas, rounded tips where sharpness seems deliberately avoided, pieces that look more like instruments than weapons, though for what kind of task, no one knows. One class of these tools resembles nothing so much as a stone thumbprint oval, slightly concave, with subtle edgeware but no clear function. Some have dubbed them manuports, suggesting they were carried rather than used. Others think they might be ritual items, or even counting devices, prehistoric tokens for things now forgotten. In other sites, napped crescents appear. They're too thin and fragile to be knives. They aren't symmetrical enough to be jewelry. Some theorize they were scrapers for soft materials, animal hides, or plant fibers, but experimental archaeology hasn't replicated convincing results. And then there are the weights. Stone objects with drilled holes, but the wrong size and shape for net sinkers or atlatl weights. A few have been found buried in isolation, with no associated tools or hearths. One was discovered wrapped in a woven mat carefully, almost reverently, as if it had significance that we're not meant to understand. There's no cultural pattern to their distribution. They show up in Fremont sites, in archaic levels, sometimes even in proto-historic contexts. Their inconsistency is what makes them remarkable. Most are dismissed quietly, labeled indeterminate lithic in site records, photographed once, filed away. The scientific impulse is to wait until a match appears somewhere else, to hold off on theories until the pattern emerges. But what if there is no pattern? Or worse, what if the pattern already existed, but the culture that made it has vanished so completely that we've forgotten how to see it? That's the terrifying implication. Because typology isn't just about naming things, it's about memory. It's the archaeology of recognition. And when a tool resists recognition when it falls between the definitions, or outside them entirely, it threatens the illusion that we understand the past. And if the past has tools we can't classify, what else is it holding? Because not far from these anomalous tools, etched into canyon walls or tucked inside obscure rock shelters, there's art that doesn't look like Fremont, Ute, or any known indigenous tradition. The lines are different, the imagery off, the feeling unmistakably foreign. Which brings us to another riddle. Isolated rock shelters containing art that doesn't match the neighborhood. Isolated rock shelters containing art that doesn't match local indigenous styles. You hike for hours through a dry wash, scale a sandstone ridge, duck beneath a ledge to escape the heat, and then, there at Island, a rock shelter. Cool, shallow, ordinary. But on the back wall, something unexpected. Pigment. Lines, images, art. But it's not what you're used to seeing in Utah. It doesn't look like Fremont. No trapezoidal bodies, no horned anthropomorphs. It's not Ute or Paiute. No horses, no shields, no battle scenes. It's not Barrier Canyon style either. None of the ghostly, floating figures with hollow eyes and insect masks. This is something else, something quieter. Stranger. The figures are often small, abstract, shapes arranged with a rhythm that feels intentional but untranslatable. Sometimes they're geometric boxes, chevrons, spirals, lattices. Other times, they seem to represent animals or humans, but stylized in unfamiliar ways. a bison with squared horns, a human with no arms but a long, segmented spine, a circle filled with radiating teeth. They're painted with red ochre, white clay, and black charcoal. No bright colors, no grand murals, just a few feet of wall, marked carefully, and left to fade. And the oddest thing? They often appear alone. No surrounding village, no artifacts, no fire pits, no discarded tools or food waste, just the art. Like someone came here, painted this, only this, and left. These isolated shelters are hard to date. There's rarely organic material for radiocarbon testing. No pottery shards to suggest a cultural layer. No stratigraphy to analyze. You can't carbon date a drawing without damaging it, and in many cases, it's the only thing left. Some of the figures bear faint resemblance to styles found far outside Utah petroglyphs in Baja, or abstract pictographs in parts of Nevada and eastern California, but they're distant cousins at best. Whatever tradition they belong to, it didn't leave a trail. One theory is that these shelters were used by travelers groups passing through, who left a mark as a kind of spiritual graffiti, not to decorate, not to tell a story, but to announce presence, a visual footprint. Another theory is more ritualistic, that the shelters were sacred spots, not for living, but for performing a moment, a vision, a rite of passage. The art was the evidence that the ritual happened, not the message it carried. Some researchers wonder if these drawings might even be signatures of lost microcultures, small groups who diverged from larger cultural traditions and created their own symbolic languages, entire belief systems that blinked out before they could be documented, peoples who didn't vanish so much as dissolve. There's also the uncomfortable possibility that these were never meant for us to find, that the art was private, protective, magical even, drawn not to communicate with others, but to seal something in or out. The shelters themselves often support that idea. They're defensively placed, hidden behind folds of stone, inaccessible without effort. Many are oriented away from the rising sun, facing shadow. Cool places, quiet places. Whatever was drawn there, whoever drew it, they wanted it to last. And it has, barely. But what's most unsettling is what's missing from these images. There's no progression, no evolution of style, no layering that suggests repeated visits over generations. These drawings often appear as one-time acts. Someone arrived, painted, and never came back. No tradition, no descent, just a mark. And then, silence. And that silence echoes in the next mystery because even in Utah's petroglyphs, some carvings defy explanation not in their meaning, but in their execution. Symbols chiseled into stone with no evidence of chisel marks. Lines etched too precisely, or in places no tool should have reached. Art without a known tool, message without a method. Petroglyphs whose creation tools are unknown, no chisel marks observed. There's a difference between something being old and something being impossible. Utah's deserts are full of petroglyphs, thousands of them. Figures etched into stone with patience, precision, and a deep sense of purpose. Animals, humans, spirals, grids, gods, monsters, maps, entire mythologies scratched onto canyon walls, baked in sunlight for centuries. We know how most of them were made. Stone tools, antler picks, abrasion techniques, pecking with harder rock. That part isn't controversial. Until it island. Because in a few rare but deeply unsettling cases, researchers and explorers have come across petroglyphs that defy the usual forensic clues. No chisel marks, no abrasion patterns, no rock dust. Just perfectly etched lines, deep, smooth, consistent without any trace of how they were carved. It's not that they're too advanced, it's that they're too clean. You can find these anomalous glyphs in remote areas, far from high-traffic archaeological sites, high on cliff faces, or tucked inside overhangs that require ropes or serious scrambling to access. Some are barely visible unless the light hits just right. Others are bold, almost modern looking, like they were made with a rotary tool, not a chunk of quartzite. A common reaction is skepticism. Surely someone used modern tools. But carbon dating of nearby organic material and weathering analysis suggests many of these glyphs are ancient. Centuries, sometimes millennia, old. Too old for steel, too old for colonial contact. Take, for example, a petroglyph panel in a narrow canyon near the Escalante River. It features a series of concentric circles intersected by a long, ruler straight line. The groove depth is uniform. The edges are sharp. No peck marks, no uneven wear. It looks machine cut, and yet it's partially buried under centuries of mineral patina. If someone forged it in modern times, they also managed to simulate at least 500 years of weathering, something even the most dedicated hoaxers can't pull off on a rock wall 20 feet up. Other examples include spiral carvings with depths too precise for abrasion methods, or figures with internal detail, tiny hatch marks, symmetrical line work, and minuscule dots, all carved into hard desert varnish. If you try to replicate this by hand with stone tools, you don't get detail. You get divots. You get chaos. There's even a theory, whispered quietly in the more esoteric corners of archaeology, that these glyphs might have been made using tools that have not survived, either because they were made from perishable materials or because they belonged to a group that disappeared without leaving other traces. Some suggest the possibility of lost lithic technologies, forms of tool-making that didn't rely on brute force but on vibration, heat, or pressure techniques we haven't identified. Others go further off the edge and propose sonic carving, plasma discharge, or the always suspect phrase, unknown energy sources. These ideas aren't backed by hard evidence, of course, but the mystery remains uncomfortably intact. The more grounded explanations are still weird. Some archaeologists think these could be the results of ultra-slow abrasion, rubbing stone against stone over months, maybe years, to achieve the smooth lines. But again, that leaves a different kind of wear, shallower grooves, rounded edges. And yet, here we are, looking at razor-thin incisions in rock faces that predate modern technology by centuries. Even more unsettling is how specific these glyphs tend to be in content. Many depict abstract or geometric form symbols without clear narrative, unlike hunting scenes or religious figures in other petroglyph panels. They're mathematical, mechanical, sometimes spatial, mapping out lines of sight, solstice points, or star alignments. But if these glyphs were so advanced in their execution, why are there so few of them? Why only in certain places? Why not a whole system of this perfect rock art? That may be the most disturbing part. Maybe it was a system, and all we have left are fragments. A tool, a method, a knowledge that once existed here and then didn't. The mystery isn't just how they carved the stone. It's why they did it in a way no one else seemed to. Were they marking something they didn't want misunderstood? Leaving signs they hoped would last longer than language? If so, they succeeded. Because we're still looking, still confused, still trying to read the message from people who carved it with invisible hands. And just around the bend from some of these impossible glyphs, there's another puzzle in stone, one not of art, but of life. Trackways, footprints, preserved in fossilized rock, showing creatures that walked here long ago, creatures we can't quite identify, and a story that no paleontologist has fully pieced together. Fossil trackways, wherein animal species cannot be definitively identified. There's a strange kind of time travel that happens in Utah. You walk across a sandstone ridge, dry and cracked under the sun, and there, under your boot, are footprints. Not recent ones, not human, but unmistakable. Pressed into stone, like the echo of something that walked through when this place was still a swamp or a shoreline. Utah's fossil trackways are world famous, especially in places like the Moab area, the San Rafael Swell, and the Grand Staircase Escalante region. Dinosaurs, mostly. Three-toed prints of theropods. Wide, flat sauropod impressions. even trackways of ancient crocodilians or early mammals. They're cataloged, classified, mapped. But not all of them. Because some trackways don't match any known species, or they resemble combinations of known species hybrids of form, size, and stride. Prints too big or too narrow, toes in the wrong configuration, gait patterns that don't match the anatomy of anything in the fossil record. Some of these prints look like they were made by bipedal creatures with elongated middle toes, clearly theropod-like, but with toe angles or pad impressions that don't line up with any genus. Others are quadrupedal, but lack claw marks, suggesting soft feet more mammalian than reptilian yet preserved in Mesozoic strata. One of the most bizarre finds is a set of tracks discovered near coral pink sand dunes. At first glance, they resemble those of a large bird, but the stride length is far too long. The depth of the impression suggests significant mass, and there's a fourth imprint slightly behind the others that doesn't belong to the foot at all. A tail, a dragging limb, something else? Paleontologists call these morphotypes, a polite way of saying, we see the shape, but we don't know the owner. It's taxonomy by silhouette, which is basically educated guessing. What complicates things further is that the fossil record in Utah is otherwise robust. The rocks are full of bones, teeth, eggshells, and known species from multiple geologic periods. You'd think every track could be matched to a known dinosaur, and yet dozens, possibly hundreds can't. Some researchers suggest these are simply under-documented species, that the bones exist somewhere but haven't been found yet. Others propose preservation anomalies, distorted prints caused by mud flow, erosion, or overlapping tracks. And in many cases, that's true. But not all. Some prints are pristine, sharp, deep, isolated, not distorted, and not duplicative of any known locomotion pattern. There are even a few human-like tracks, which before we go any further are not being proposed here as evidence of ancient humans walking with dinosaurs. That's a tired, debunked narrative. But there are tracks that are confusing. The right length, the wrong context, seemingly barefoot, with toe splay and arch, found in rock layers dated far too early for human activity. The official explanation? Misinterpreted natural features or eroded animal tracks. Maybe. But as always, the desert doesn't explain, it just offers. And the fossil trackways continue to pose the same riddle. Why would there be clear evidence of movement from creatures we can't identify? Why so many footprints and so few bodies? It's almost like these creatures were passing through just long enough to leave a mark, then gone. Like ghosts made of muscle and bone. And this theme of sudden departure, of whole populations vanishing, shows up again in the archaeological record. Because some ancient canyon settlements, once thriving with life and trade and structure, go silent, empty. Not gradually, not gently, but suddenly. And no one can explain why. Mystery of sudden population. Disappearance from some canyon settlements. There are ghost towns in the desert that never knew steel or streets only stone, dust, and the quiet aftermath of people who left without saying goodbye. Scattered across Utah's southern canyonlands, places like Cedar Mesa, Comb Ridge, and Dark Canyon lie the ruins of once thriving settlements. Granaries tucked into cliff faces, masonry rooms still standing against centuries of wind, and remnants of irrigation canals cut into the rock. Everything says someone lived here. Not for a moment, but for generations. And then, they stopped. Not gradually, not in a slow fade marked by architectural decay or dwindling material culture, but suddenly, entire villages vacated in the span of a single archaeological layer, tools left behind. Food still stored, fires gone cold, no signs of destruction, no signs of war, just absence. The ancestral Puebloans, often called the Anasazi, though that term has fallen out of favor, inhabited much of this region between 500 and 1300 CE. Their culture was sophisticated, agriculture-based. Ceremonial. They built kivas, engineered water collection systems, and traded as far as Mexico. Then, sometime around the late 13th century, something happened. Or, more accurately, everything stopped happening. In some canyon sites, occupancy data drops off a cliff, rooms abandoned en masse, pottery sherds dating only up to a certain point and then ceasing entirely. The question is always the same. Why? The leading theory is drought. Dendrochronology tree ring analysis shows a period of prolonged aridity during the late 1200 seconds. Water sources would have dried up. Crops failed. Conflict over resources increased. People would have migrated to more stable regions, possibly toward the Rio Grande or the Hopi Mesas. That makes sense. Until it doesn't. Because some settlements were built in places that should have weathered a drought, protected springs, clever water traps, high elevation agricultural terraces, they had fallback plans. And yet, even these resilient sites were abandoned. Simultaneously. Rapidly. Others suggest social upheaval, perhaps religious or political shifts fractured communities, or trade networks collapsed, or external pressures, rival groups, disease, or environmental catastrophe forced a collective migration. But again, there's no uniform evidence, no panicked burials, no burned dwellings, no scatter patterns suggesting a siege. The people didn't flee. They left. Sometimes they covered their kivas. Sometimes they sealed their storage rooms. In a few cases, rock art suggests intentional finality figures walking away, spirals pointing downward, handprints turning inward, as if they weren't just abandoning a home, but finishing something. There are theories no one likes to say out loud, that maybe they didn't just move somewhere else, that maybe they weren't allowed to stay. Or maybe something changed something in the land, the sky, the relationship between people and the world they lived in. A covenant broken, a message misunderstood, not cataclysm, not conflict. Something subtler, but just as final. We don't know. We might never know. What we do have are ruins, some barely touched, others eerily well preserved, whispering the absence of people who once knew how to survive in the impossible. And that absence lingers. It lingers in the hollow granaries, in the steps carved into sheer canyon walls, in the pathways that lead nowhere. It's a silence that doesn't settle. It hovers, like someone might still come back. Like they only left yesterday. And deep in these same abandoned settlements, another mystery smolders, the presence of ceremonial fire sites, hidden, precise, surrounded by nothing. As if the last act before departure wasn't escape, but ritual. Unknown ceremonial fire sites, located deep in backcountry ruins. The ruins alone would be enough abandoned dwellings, storage bins tucked into cliffs, stone rooms roofed with timbers older than most countries. But sometimes, what lies beneath those ruins, or hidden just beyond them, is even stranger. Ceremonial fire sites, isolated, deliberate, and still faintly marked by soot that refuses to be forgotten. These aren't ordinary hearths. They're not for cooking, not for warmth. There's no midden layer, no discarded bones, no utilitarian refuse. Just small basins, often circular, sometimes lined with stone or plaster, ringed with ashy residue and occasionally burned offerings, feathers, seeds, pigment powder, even pieces of worked stone. They're always out of the way, off the main track, inside caves, under outcroppings, nestled in tight alcoves where a fire would offer no comfort, too cramped to sit beside, too hidden to share. But they weren't accidental. One site near Bears Ears features a small fire basin tucked behind a panel of faded rock art. The area has no signs of habitation, no granaries, no structures, no trails. Just the fire ring, soot-blackened stone, and a nearby cache of red ochre, not scattered, stored. Another site in the San Rafael swell contains multiple fire basins arranged in a triangular pattern, each one equidistant from the others, each burned down to charcoal and sand. The contents were sifted, not dumped. Someone managed the ash, filtered it. Who does that for a campfire? The spacing and geometry of these features suggest planning, ritual, precision. Some fire rings align with solstice points. Others face cardinal directions. A few are nestled beneath overhangs, where water drips just once per minute, timed rhythms echoing through otherwise dry stone. What were they burning? What were they doing? Some theorize these were places of offering, where food or sacred objects were placed into fire to communicate with spirits or deities. Others propose they were purification sites, spaces to cleanse individuals before entering sacred dwellings or conducting ceremony. But here's the rub. Many of these fire sites are nowhere near dwellings. There's no ceremonial center, no great kiva, no village plaza. They're miles from anything else. Which raises the question, were they destination rituals? Did people trek into the wilds to light a fire, make an offering, and leave? Or did the land itself demand the fire something innate to the rock, the place, the silence? And then there's the really uncomfortable possibility that these fires weren't for the people who made them, that they were for something else, some presence, not worshipped, not understood, just acknowledged, as if the act of fire was a signal, a reminder, a negotiation. Because fire doesn't just destroy, it transforms. It crosses thresholds. It takes the solid and turns it to smoke, something that can rise, vanish, become part of the air. And maybe that's what these people needed, a way to send something upward. A thought, a memory, a warning. And if the fire was the message, then the ashes are the unanswered reply. Scattered, layered, buried, but still there. Waiting, and not far from these scorched ceremonial zones, etched into the cliffs and aligned just so, there's another pattern, a subtle one, rock art that seems to mark more than myth, more than memory. Possibly the sky itself, markers pointing to solstice events, or something worse, rock art alignments that might point toward solstice events, but unverified. Sunlight in the desert is usually merciless, indiscriminate, absolute. It bleaches bones and bakes canyons, defines time by absence rather than rhythm. But every so often, in the right place, at the right hour, the sun behaves differently surgically. A single shaft of light cuts through shadow, landing on a rock panel that until then seemed meaningless. And in that moment, everything changes. Utah's rock art has long been admired for its aesthetic mystery. But some panels hint at something deeper, intentional alignments with celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, lunar standstills, patterns of light and shadow that only emerge on specific days of the year, at specific hours, casting a brief and eerie animation across figures carved or painted centuries ago. Take the so-called sun dagger phenomena, most famously known from Chaco Canyon, but echoed in lesser-known sites throughout southern Utah. In one high desert alcove, a spiral petroglyph lies dormant until the summer solstice, when a sliver of light threads through a narrow crevice and lands perfectly on its center, splitting the spiral into two halves like a clock striking noon. That's not random. That's astronomy, written in stone. There are whispers of similar alignments in places like the San Rafael swell and Bear's Ears, where figures seem to interact with light in ways that transcend art. A beam illuminates a horned anthropomorph's eye. A shadow creeps up the belly of a serpent carving and stops precisely at the solstice line. Concentric circles go dark, one ring at a time, like a countdown to something we no longer understand. But here's the catch. None of it is officially verified. Why? Because it's hard to prove. These alignments are ephemeral. You get a 10-minute window once or twice a year. Miss it, and you wait 12 months. The weather has to cooperate. So does your timing. And in many cases, The landscape has shifted: erosion, rockfall, human interference. What might have worked 1,000 years ago could now be just a shadow of the original intention. Archaeologists tread carefully here. The line between empirical observation and wishful pattern-making is razor thin. If you stare at rock art long enough, you'll start to see things, alignments, faces, meanings that were never there. Pareidolia wrapped in sandstone. But even skeptics have to admit, the precision of some of these alignments is unnerving. One panel near Capitol Reef features a figure standing between two carved vertical lines. On the winter solstice, the rising sun casts a perfectly straight shadow down the center line, splitting the figure in half. Whether this was deliberate or not, the result feels intentional, symbolic, like someone marked that place as a hinge in the year the moment the days begin to lengthen again. Another case near the Fremont River shows a jagged line etched above a series of dots. On the equinox, the line aligns perfectly with the mountain ridgeline in the distance as the sun crests it. Were the dots counting days, stars, ritual steps? No one knows. These rock art alignments don't tell stories the way myths do. They don't speak in language. They speak in shadow, in silence, in the slow annual return of a light that reminds you the world still moves, whether you're watching or not. And maybe that's what they were for, not to explain the heavens, but to notice them. To say, we were here, we saw, we marked. Or, more disturbingly, we were told to mark. Because some of these alignments don't just track celestial bodies, they seem to point toward future events, astronomical cycles that take centuries to complete, alignments that aren't visible in a single lifetime. Were they warnings, calendars, invitations? We don't know, because we've lost a manual. All we have are the scars in stone and the brief, brilliant moments when the light returns. But on some cliffs, the message isn't in the sunlight. It's carved directly into the rock. Symbols that match no known language. No tribe claims them. No scholar deciphers them. No one even agrees on what they are. Just marks, left behind, like someone was trying to say something to whoever came next. Mysterious carved symbols on canyon walls, with no relating stories or myths. They're not images, not animals, gods, or people. They don't walk, they don't float, they don't tell tales. These are symbols pure and blunt, etched into sandstone walls, often in isolation, often in places that seem aggressively meaningless. Wind-beaten alcoves, sheer cliffs miles from water, the backsides of canyons no one traverses. And they don't match anything we know. No relation to Fremont iconography, no tie to Barrier Canyon motifs, no echoes of Ute pictography or Navajo cosmology, not even distant cousins of Mesoamerican glyphs. These symbols sit outside the family tree, feral children of some extinct script, if they were even meant to be read at all. Some resemble simple geometric forms, triangles, hash marks, intersecting lines, spirals nested inside boxes. Others look disturbingly complex, like flowcharts for machines that never existed, or shorthand for concepts we don't have words for. A few have been repeated in multiple locations, miles apart, but always in the same isolated context. No narrative panels, no accompanying art, no settlements nearby, just that symbol alone. It's as if the message was meant only for someone who already knew how to read it. Researchers have proposed several theories. The most conservative is that these were personal marks, proto-writing used by individuals or small groups to record travel, ownership, or ritual presence. That theory fits nicely into what archaeologists call non-iconic rock markings, basically ancient graffiti with no deeper meaning than "I was here." But if that were true, you'd expect inconsistency, random placement, variability. Instead, the opposite is often observed. The symbols are precise, repeated, aligned, always carved with care, never casual. Some symbols are deeply incised, requiring time and effort to make. You don't climb a cliff, chip into sandstone for hours, and walk away unless you think what you're doing matters. More ambitious interpretations propose a forgotten symbolic language, an extinct semiotic system developed by a culture that never got to grow old, a kind of proto-alphabet that died before it could speak. If true, these marks would represent one of the oldest and most geographically isolated writing systems in North America. There's even a fringe theory, unverified, unpublishable, but whispered that some of these symbols correlate with known constellations, that they were meant to mirror the night sky. A star map, not drawn on paper, but carved into the living stone of the earth, perhaps to outlast floods, fires, and memory itself. But no oral tradition explains them. No tribe claims them. When elders are shown photos, they often shake their heads and say, "That's not ours," which is perhaps the most unsettling part. Because most rock art in Utah, regardless of age or culture, has some modern descendant who can speak to it. That's our ancestor. That's our story. That's the trickster. That's the hunt. But these symbols? They've been orphaned, not just from history, but from meaning. And yet they persist. They weather. They wait. Were they a cipher, a curse, a coordinate? Or just noise? Scratches with no signal, no voice behind them? We want them to mean something, because if they don't, that's worse. It means that people once carved things into rock, certain they mattered, and we can't even tell if they were right. And if those symbols were meant to mark boundaries, they failed, because just beyond them, buried under millennia of dust and silence, are legends. Of places too old, too strange, and according to some, too early to exist at all. Settlements from before the Fremont, before the known tribes. Stories of a time that shouldn't be real, and a people we can't name. Legends of pre-Fremont occupation sites, dated too early for current frameworks. History, for all its pageantry and precision, is mostly scaffolding, a framework we build to keep the past from collapsing into myth. In Utah, that framework is already precarious, propped up by tree rings, pottery shards, carbon dates, and the occasional dusty bone. But every now and then, something doesn't fit. A settlement, a structure, a story anchored in stone, but floating outside the timeline. And that's where the legends of pre-Fremont occupation sites begin to breathe. The Fremont culture, by academic consensus, flourished in Utah from around 300 to 1300 CE. Their fingerprints are everywhere. Granaries, figurines, irrigation systems, signature petroglyphs. But before the Fremont, the land was supposedly quieter, scattered with mobile archaic foragers. No large villages, no intensive agriculture, no real long-term structures. Except, there are whispers otherwise. Take the case of a cluster of semi-subterranean pit houses discovered in a remote canyon northwest of the Green River. The structures were typical round, dug into the earth, rimmed with stone, and initially assumed to be Fremont until the radiocarbon dates came back, 1800 BCE. More than 1,000 years too early. The site yielded tools, bone fragments, and fire pits, but no Fremont-style artifacts. The projectile points resembled Great Basin stemmed types, yet with slight deviations, enough to raise eyebrows. Enough to wonder, was this simply an unusually settled archaic group, or someone else? Archaeologists tried to categorize it under the Desert Archaic label, a catch-all term that basically means, we don't know, but it probably wasn't aliens. But that label's a shrug. It acknowledges presence without explaining identity. Further south, in the cliffs near the Escalante River, petroglyphs that predate the Fremont have been found by centuries. Simple lines, geometric grids, and humanoid stick figures arranged in unfamiliar patterns. They're not as stylized as Barrier Canyon style. They don't follow the known visual grammar. Some appear deliberately erased, scratched out, painted over, repurposed. Others were preserved through sheer obscurity, protected by isolation. Then there's the oral record, thin, often ignored, but quietly persistent. Several Ute and Paiute elders have told stories, sometimes reluctantly, about the old ones. Not the Fremont, not the Anasazi, but someone else. People who lived in the caves long before memory, who built things and vanished, not due to conflict, but because they were called away or swallowed by the stone. And while such stories are often treated as poetic metaphor, it's worth noting, in many cases, they correspond eerily well with sites that still defy categorization. One canyon, largely inaccessible and mapped only in recent years, revealed multiple walled enclosures, rooms built with a masonry technique unlike any surrounding culture. No mortar. Just tight-fitting sandstone slabs, slanted at intentional angles, with no roof timbers, dated to over 2,500 years ago. No fire pits, no food storage, just walls, holding nothing. Who builds a room they never use? Another enigmatic case involves a stone-lined trail visible only from aerial surveys snaking across miles of barren plateau, terminating in a cliffside cave with no evident utility, no water, no shelter. Inside, a single flat stone, blackened by heat, surrounded by concentric circles carved into the floor. There are no Fremont artifacts, no Ute tools, no potsherds, no bones. Just the trail, the cave, the heat-scarred altar, and the silence of 3,000 years. Academics, when faced with such anomalies, often retreat into vague phrasing: cultural precursor, transitional occupation, anomalous feature. What they don't say but sometimes admit privately is that these places feel older than they should be. Not just chronologically, conceptually. Because these early sites don't show evolution, they don't transition smoothly into known cultures. They exist like in time moments of organization, ritual, and architecture that don't lead to anything. They just happen, then vanish. And if we take that seriously, it raises a difficult question. What if there were entire peoples who built, carved, and worshipped here and left no lineage? What if pre-Fremont Utah was not a blank slate, but a palimpsest scratched over again and again, but never fully erased? That possibility makes archaeologists deeply uncomfortable, because it suggests gaps in the record so wide they can't be bridged with pottery sequences or typology charts. It suggests we are building our knowledge of the past atop ruins we can't even see, or worse, won't admit are there. And maybe that's the point of these final mysteries. They're not meant to be solved. They're meant to expose the limits of our confidence. To remind us that even the most established chronologies are just stories we tell ourselves to keep the darkness orderly. Utah's pre-flood mysteries aren't just fragments of a forgotten past. They're cracks in the foundation of how we construct the past. And through those cracks, the unknown still waits. Unclassified, unclaimed, unexplained. And still watching.